Counter-Rev Audio. April 2021. Democracy, the God That Failed. The Economics and Politics of Monarchy, Democracy, and Natural Order. Hans-Herman Hoppe. Published in 2001 by Transaction Publishers, New Brunswick, New Jersey. If this is accepted, how is a government to be organized so as to assure that it will in fact do what it is supposed to do, protect pre-existing private property rights? In view of what I shall say later on in favor of the institution of monarchy, Mises' liberal opposition to the ancien regime of absolute kings and princes is worth noting here. Kings and princes were privileged personae. Almost by definition, they stood opposed to the liberal idea of the unity and universality of law. Thus, Mises stated, the liberal theory of the state is hostile to princes. The princely state has no natural boundaries. To be an increaser of his family estate is the ideal of the prince. He strives to leave his successor more land than he inherited from his father. To keep on acquiring new possessions until one encounters an equally strong or stronger adversary, that is the striving of kings. Princes regard countries no differently from the way an estate owner regards his forests, meadows, and fields. They sell them, they exchange them, example, rounding off boundaries, and each time rule over the inhabitants is transferred also. Lands and peoples are, in the eyes of princes, nothing but objects of princely ownership. The former form the basis of sovereignty, the latter the appurtenances of land ownership. From the people who live in his land the prince demands obedience and loyalty. He regards them almost as his property. As Mises rejected a princely state as incompatible with the protection of private property rights, what was to be substituted for it? His answer was democracy and democratic government. However, Mises' definition of democratic government is fundamentally different from its colloquial meaning. Mises grew up in a multinational state and was painfully aware of the antiliberal results of majority rule in ethnically mixed territories. Rather than majority rule, to Mises democracy meant literally self-determination, self-government, self-rule, and accordingly, a democratic government was an essentially voluntary membership organization in that it recognized each of its constituents' unrestricted right to secession. Liberalism, explained Mises, forces no one against his will into the structure of the state. Whoever wants to emigrate is not held back. When a part of the people of a state wants to drop out of the Union, liberalism does not hinder it from doing so. Colonies that want to become independent need only do so. The nation as an organic entity can be neither increased nor reduced by changes in states. The world as a whole can neither win nor lose from them. The right of self-determination in regard to the question of membership in a state thus means, whenever the inhabitants of a particular territory, whether it be a single village, a whole district, or a series of adjacent districts, make it known, by a freely conducted plebiscite, that they no longer wish to remain united to the state to which they belong at the time, their wishes are to be respected and complied with. This is the only feasible and effective way of preventing revolutions and international wars. If it were in any way possible to grant this right of self-determination to every individual person, it would have to be done. Hence, Mises' answer as to how to assure that a government will protect property rights is through the threat of unlimited secession and its own characteristic of voluntary membership. I do not wish to further investigate Mises' idea of democratic government here, but to turn instead to the modern definition of democracy and the question of its compatibility with the foundation of liberalism, that of private property and its protection. It might be argued that Mises' definition of democratic government was applicable to the US until 1861. Until then, it was generally held that the right to secession existed and that the Union was nothing but a voluntary association of independent states. However, after the crushing defeat and devastation of the secessionist Confederacy by Lincoln and the Union, it was clear that the right to secede no longer existed and that democracy meant absolute and unlimited majority rule. Nor does it appear that any state since that time has met Mises' definition of democratic government. Instead, like their American model, all modern democracies are compulsory membership organizations. It is all the more surprising that Mises never subjected this modern model of democracy to the same systematic analysis that he had applied to princely government. To be sure, no one has been more far-sighted regarding the destructive effects of modern government's social and economic policies than Mises, and no one has recognized more clearly the dramatic increase of state power in the course of the 20th century, but Mises never connected these phenomena systematically with modern compulsory democracy. Nowhere did he suggest that the decline of liberalism and the dominance of anti-capitalist political ideologies in this century of socialism, social democracy, democratic capitalism, social market economics, or whatever other label has been attached to various anti-liberal programs and policies finds its systematic explanation in majoritarian democracy itself. What I propose to do here is to fill in the gap left by Mises and provide an analysis of the logic of majoritarian democracy, thereby making modern history, our age, intelligible and predictable. Without the right to secession, a democratic government is, economically speaking, a compulsory territorial monopolist of protection and ultimate decision-making, jurisdiction, and is in this respect indistinguishable from princely government. Just as princes did not allow secession, so it is outlawed under democracy. Furthermore, as implied in the position of a compulsory monopolist, both democratic government as well as princes possess the right to tax. That is, both are permitted to determine unilaterally, without consent of the protected, the sum that the protected must pay for their own protection. From this common classification as compulsory monopolies, a fundamental similarity of both princely and democratic government can be deduced. Under monopolistic auspices, the price of justice and protection will continually rise and the quantity and quality of justice and protection fall. Qua expropriating property protector, a tax-funded protection agency is a contradiction in terms and will inevitably lead to more taxes and less protection. Even if, as liberals advocate, a government limited its activities exclusively to the protection of pre-existing property rights, the further question of how much protection to produce arises. Motivated, as everyone is, by self-interest and the disutility of labor but with the unique power to tax, a government agent's response will invariably be the same, to maximize expenditures on protection, and conceivably almost all of a nation's wealth can be consumed by the cost of protection and at the same time to minimize the actual production of protection. The more money one can spend and the less one must work to produce, the better off one will be. Moreover, a monopoly of jurisdiction will inevitably lead to a steady deterioration in the quality of protection. If one can appeal exclusively to government for justice, justice will be distorted in favor of government, constitutions and appeals courts notwithstanding. Constitutions and appeals courts are government constitutions and agencies, and any limitations on government action they might provide are invariably decided by agents of one and the same institution. Predictably, the definition of property and protection will continually be altered and the range of jurisdiction expanded to the government's advantage. IV. While they are both inconsistent with the protection of life and property, princely and democratic government are also different in one fundamental respect. The decisive difference lies in the fact that entry into a princely government is systematically restricted by the prince's personal discretion, while under democracy entry into and participation in government is open to everyone on equal terms. Anyone not just a hereditary class of nobles is permitted to become a government official and exercise any government function, all the way up to that of prime minister or president. Typically, this distinction between restricted versus free entry into government and the transition from princely to democratic government has been interpreted as an advance toward liberalism, from a society of status and privilege to one of equality before the law. But this interpretation rests on a fundamental misunderstanding. From a classical liberal point of view, democratic government must be considered worse than and a regression from princely government. Free and equal entry into government democratic equality is something entirely different from and incompatible with the classical liberal concept of one universal law, equally applicable to everyone, everywhere, and at all times. Liberalism, Mises noted, strives for the greatest possible unification of law, in the last analysis for world unity of law. However, free entry into government does not accomplish this goal. To the contrary, the objectionable inequality of the higher law of princes versus the subordinate law of ordinary subjects is preserved under democracy in the separation of public versus private law and the supremacy of the former over the latter. Under democracy, everyone is equal insofar as entry into government is open to all on the same terms. In a democracy, no personal privileges or privileged persons exist. However, functional privileges and privileged functions exist. As long as they act in an official capacity, democratic government agents are governed and protected by public law and thereby occupy a privileged position vis-a-vis persons acting under the mere authority of private law, most fundamentally in being permitted to support their own activities by taxes imposed on private law subjects. Privileges, discrimination, and protectionism do not disappear. To the contrary, Rather than being restricted to princes and nobles, privileges, discrimination, and protectionism can be exercised by and accorded to everyone. Predictably, under democratic conditions, the tendency of every compulsory monopoly to increase prices and decrease quality is strengthened. As a hereditary monopolist, a prince regards the territory and people under his jurisdiction as his personal property and engages in the monopolistic exploitation of his property. Under democracy, exploitation does not disappear. Even though everyone is permitted to enter government, this does not eliminate the distinction between the rulers and the ruled. Government and the governed are not one and the same person. Instead of a prince who considers the country his private property, a temporary and interchangeable caretaker is put in monopolistic charge. The caretaker does not own the country, but as long as he is in office he is permitted to use it to his and his protégés' advantage. He owns its current usufruct, but not its capital stock. This does not eliminate exploitation. Rather, it makes exploitation less calculating and carried out with little or no regard to the capital stock. In other words, it is short-sighted. Both hereditary princes and democratic caretakers can increase their current spending by means of higher taxes. However, a prince tends to avoid increasing taxes if this leads to capital consumption, a drop in the present discounted value of the capital stock of which he is the owner. In contrast, a caretaker shows no such reluctance. While he owns the present tax revenue, he does not own the capital stock from which it is derived, others do. Accordingly, under democratic conditions, taxation increases far beyond its level under princely rule. In addition, both princes and caretakers can increase their current spending by means of debt, and endowed with the power to tax, both tend to incur more debt than would private citizens. However, whereas a prince assumes a liability against his personal property whenever he borrows from, sells bonds to the non-government public, hence the present value of his property falls, a democratic caretaker is free of any such consideration. He can enjoy all the benefits of higher current spending, while the liability and concurrent drop in property values falls upon others. Accordingly, government debt is higher and increases faster under democratic conditions than under princely rule. Finally, both princes and caretakers can use their compulsory monopoly power to gain control over the money supply, so both can also increase their own present spending by inflating the supply of money. However, a prince who inflates the money supply will weigh two factors: his immediate enrichment and the fact that, as the inevitable result of a larger money supply, the future purchasing power of money and of his own future taxes will be lower. Unlike a prince, a democratic caretaker is concerned only with his immediate enrichment, for he does not own current and future tax revenues. He only owns the present tax revenue, so he is solely concerned with the present purchasing power of money. By increasing the money supply, he can increase his present purchasing power, while the attendant lower purchasing power of money and tax receipts must be borne in the future by others. Accordingly, money inflation will also be more prevalent under democratic conditions than under princely rule. Moreover, with free entry into and participation in government, the perversion of justice and protection, law and order, will proceed even faster. The notion of universal and immutable human rights, and in particular of property rights, essentially disappears and is replaced by that of law as government-made legislation and rights as government-given grants. Rather than just redistributing income and wealth from civil society onto government by means of taxation, deficit financing, and money inflation, both hereditary princes and democratic caretakers can also use their monopoly of jurisdiction for the redistribution of income and wealth within civil society. The incentives faced in this regard by princes and caretakers are distinctly different, however. It is instructive to take another look at princely government. As regards redistribution, princes face two disincentives. The first is a logical one. Even though a prince ranks above everyone else, his rights, too, are private rights, albeit of a somewhat elevated kind. If a prince takes the property of one person and distributes it to another, he undermines the principle on which his own position and security vis-a-vis other princes rests. Second, from an economic point of view, all general income and wealth redistribution from the haves of something to the have-nots is counterproductive and reduces the overall value of the territory. This is not to say that princes abstain from redistributive policies entirely, but their policies take a distinctly different form. On the one hand, they must appear in accordance with the idea of private property rights; on the other hand, they should increase future productivity and hence the country's present value. Accordingly, princes typically grant personal rather than group privileges, they award privileges to haves instead of have-nots, and they attend to so-called social problems by reallocating labor cultivation, acculturation, and colonization policies rather than redistributing income and wealth. In contrast, a democratic caretaker faces no logical obstacle to the redistribution of private property. Rather than involving himself with the preservation and improvement of capital values, he will be concerned primarily with the protection and advancement of his own position against the competition of new government entrants. This type of caretaker's legitimacy does not rest on the legitimacy of private property. It rests on the legitimacy of social or public property. Thus, if he takes property from one person and gives it to another, as a caretaker he does not contradict his own ideological foundation. Rather, he affirms the supremacy of the different principle of social ownership. Consequently, under democratic conditions, private law, the law of property and contract underlying civil society, disappears as an independent domain of law and is absorbed by an all-encompassing public, government-made, law, legislation. As the German socialist legal theorist Gustav Radbruch noted, from the perspective of a democratic caretaker, private law is to be regarded only as a provisional and constantly decreasing range of private initiative, temporarily spared within the all-comprehensive sphere of public law. Ultimately, all property is public property. Each established private property right is only provisionally valid and may be altered in accordance with a caretaker's unilateral determination of the requirements of public safety and social security. Second, and more specifically, because caretakers do not own the country's capital stock, the counterproductive effects of income and wealth redistribution are of little or no concern. However, the long-term repercussions of redistributive measures are unimportant to them, while their immediate and short-term effects are not. A caretaker is always under the pressure of political competition from others seeking to replace him. Given the rules of democratic government of one-man only vote and majority rule, a caretaker, whether to secure his present position or advance to another, must award or promise to award privileges to groups rather than particular individuals, and given that there always exist more have-nots than haves of everything worth having, his redistribution will be egalitarian rather than elitist. Accordingly, as the result of democratic competition, the character structure of society will be progressively deformed. For one, regardless of the criteria on which it is based, all redistribution involves taking from an original owner and or producer the haver of something and giving to another non-owner and or non-producer the non-haver of this thing. The incentive to be an original owner or producer of the thing in question is reduced, and the incentive to be a non-owner and non-producer is raised. Consequently, the number of havers and producers declines and that of non-havers and non-producers rises. And since it is presumably something good that is being redistributed, of which the haver producers have too much and the non-haver non-producers too little, this change implies quite literally that the relative number of bad or not so good people and bad or not so good personal characteristics and habits will continually rise, and life in society will become increasingly less pleasant. Rather than colonization, cultivation, and acculturation, democracy will bring about social degeneration, corruption, and decay. Moreover, free competition is not always good. Free competition in the production of goods is good, but free competition in the production of bads is not. Free competition in the torturing and killing of innocents, or free competition in counterfeiting or swindling, for instance, is not good, it is worse than bad. It has already been explained why government as a compulsory membership organization endowed with the power of ultimate decision-making and taxation must be considered a bad, at least from a liberal viewpoint. It requires a second look to realize that democratic competition is indeed worse than bad. In every society, as long as mankind is what it is, people who covet another man's property will exist. Some people are more afflicted by this sentiment than others. But people usually learn not to act on such feelings or even feel ashamed for entertaining them. Generally, only a few individuals are unable to successfully suppress their desire for others' property, and they are treated as criminals by their fellow men and repressed by physical punishment. Under princely rule, only one single person, the prince, can possibly act on the desire for another man's property, and it is this which makes him a potential danger and a bad. Apart from the already noted logical and economic disincentives, however, a prince is further restrained in his redistributive desires by the circumstance that all members of society have learned to regard the taking and redistributing of another man's property as shameful and immoral, and accordingly watch a prince's every action with utmost suspicion. In distinct contrast, by freeing up entry into government, everyone is permitted to openly express his desire for other men's property. What was formerly regarded as immoral and accordingly suppressed is now considered a legitimate sentiment. Everyone may openly covet everyone else's property as long as he appeals to democracy, and everyone may act on his desire for another man's property, provided that he finds entrance into government. Hence, under democracy everyone becomes a threat. Consequently, under democratic conditions the popular, if immoral and antisocial, desire for other men's property is systematically strengthened. Every demand is legitimate if it is proclaimed publicly under the special protection of freedom of speech. Everything can be said and claimed, and everything is up for grabs. Not even the seemingly most secure private property right is exempt from redistributive demands. Worse, subject to mass elections, those members of society with little or no moral inhibition against taking another man's property, habitual immoralists who are most talented in assembling majorities from a multitude of morally uninhibited and mutually incompatible popular demands, efficient demagogues, will tend to gain entrance in and rise to the top of government. Hence, a bad situation becomes even worse. Historically, the selection of a prince was through the accident of his noble birth, and his only personal qualification was typically his upbringing as a future prince and preserver of the dynasty and its status and possessions. This did not assure that a prince would not be bad and dangerous, of course. However, it is worth remembering that any prince who failed in his primary duty of preserving the dynasty, who wrecked or ruined the country, caused civil unrest, turmoil and strife, or otherwise endangered the position of the dynasty, faced the immediate risk of either being neutralized or assassinated by another member of his own family. In any case, however, even if the accident of birth and his upbringing could not preclude that a prince might be bad and dangerous, at the same time the accident of a noble birth and a princely education also did not preclude that he might be a harmless dilettante or even a good and moral person. In contrast, the selection of government rulers by means of popular elections makes it practically impossible that any good or harmless person could ever rise to the top. Prime ministers and presidents are selected for their proven efficiency as morally uninhibited demagogues. Thus, democracy virtually assures that only bad and dangerous men will ever rise to the top of government. Indeed, as the result of free political competition and selection, those who rise will become increasingly bad and dangerous individuals, yet as temporary and interchangeable caretakers they will only rarely be assassinated. 6. After more than a century of compulsory democracy, the predictable results are before our very eyes. The tax load imposed on property owners and producers makes the economic burden even of slaves and serfs seem moderate in comparison. Government debt has risen to breathtaking heights. Gold has been replaced by government-manufactured paper as money, and its value has continually dwindled. Every detail of private life, property, trade, and contract is regulated by ever higher mountains of paper laws, legislation. In the name of social, public or national security, our caretakers protect us from global warming and cooling and the extinction of animals and plants, from husbands and wives, parents and employers, poverty, disease, disaster, ignorance, prejudice, racism, sexism, homophobia, and countless other public enemies and dangers. And with enormous stockpiles of weapons of aggression and mass destruction they defend us, even outside of the US, from ever new Hitlers and all suspected Hitlerite sympathizers. However, the only task a government was ever supposed to assume, of protecting our life and property, our caretakers do not perform. To the contrary, the higher the expenditures on social, public, and national security have risen, the more our private property rights have been eroded, the more our property has been expropriated, confiscated, destroyed, and depreciated, and the more we have been deprived of the very foundation of all protection, of personal independence, economic strength, and private wealth. The more paper laws have been produced, the more legal uncertainty and moral hazard has been created, and lawlessness has displaced law and order. And while we have become ever more helpless, impoverished, threatened, and insecure, our rulers have become increasingly more corrupt, dangerously armed, and arrogant. At this point, the question of the future of liberalism arises. It is appropriate to return to my beginning, to Ludwig von Mises and the idea of a liberal social order. Like Etienne de la Bataille and David Hume before him, Mises recognized that the power of every government, whether of princes or caretakers, benevolent men or tyrants, rests ultimately on opinion rather than physical force. The agents of government are always only a small proportion of the total population under their control, whether under princely or democratic rule. Even smaller is the proportion of central government agents. But this implies that a government, and in particular a central government, cannot possibly impose its will upon the entire population unless it finds widespread support and voluntary cooperation within the non-governmental public. As La Botille put it, he who thus domineers over you has indeed nothing more than the power that you confer upon him to destroy you. Where has he acquired enough eyes to spy upon you if you do not provide them yourselves? How can he have so many arms to beat you with if he does not borrow them from you? The feet that trample down your cities, where does he get them if they are not your own? How does he have any power over you except through you? How would he dare assail you if he had no cooperation from you? What would he do to you if you yourself did not connive with the thief who plunders you, if you were not accomplices of the murderer who kills you, if you were not traitors to yourselves? You sow your crops in order that he may ravage them, you install and furnish your homes to give him goods to pillage, you rear your daughters that he may gratify his lust, you bring up your children in order that he may confer upon them the greatest privilege he knows, to be led into his battles, to be delivered to butchery, to be made the servants of his greed and the instruments of his vengeance. You yield your bodies unto hard labor in order that he may indulge in his delights and wallow in his filthy pleasures, you weaken yourselves in order to make him the stronger and mightier to hold you in check. However, if the power of every government rests only on opinion and consensual cooperation, then, as Mises' foremost student and our other intellectual master, Murray N. Rothbard, explained in his introduction to La Botille's 16th century treatise, it also follows that each government can be brought down by a mere change of opinion and the exercise of sheer willpower. For if tyranny really rests on mass consent, then the obvious means for its overthrow is simply mass withdrawal of that consent. That is, in order to strip government of its powers and repair it to the status of a voluntary membership organization, as before 1861, it is not necessary to take it over, to engage in violent battle against it, or even to lay hands on one's rulers. In fact, to do so would only reaffirm the principle of compulsion and aggressive violence underlying the current system and inevitably lead to the replacement of one government or tyrant by another. To the contrary, it is only necessary that one decide to withdraw from the compulsory union and reassume one's right to self-protection. Indeed, it is essential that one proceed in no other way than by peaceful secession and non-cooperation. If this advice seems at first naive, what difference does it make if you or I decide to secede from the union? Its status as a genuine strategy of social revolution becomes apparent once the full implications of an act of personal secession are spelled out. The decision to secede involves that one regard the central government as illegitimate, and that one accordingly treat it and its agents as an outlaw agency and foreign occupying forces. That is, if compelled by them, one complies out of prudence and for no other reason than self-preservation, but one does nothing to support or facilitate their operations. One tries to keep as much of one's property and surrender as little tax money as possible. One considers all federal law, legislation, and regulation null and void and ignores it whenever possible. One does not work or volunteer for the central government, whether its executive, legislative, or judicial branch, and one does not associate with anyone who does, and in particular not with those high up in the hierarchy of caretakers. One does not participate in central government politics and contributes nothing to the operation of the federal political machinery. One does not contribute to any national political party or political campaign, nor to any organization, agency, foundation, institute, or think tank cooperating with or funded by any branch of the federal Leviathan or anyone living or working in or near Washington, D.C. Instead, with as much of one's property as can possibly be secured from the hands of government, one begins to provide for one's own protection and adopts a new systematic twofold investment strategy. On the one hand, just as the existence of private crime requires an appropriate defense such as locks, guns, gates, guards, and insurance, so the existence of government requires specific defense measures that one invest in such forms and at such locations which withdraw, remove, hide, or conceal one's wealth as far as possible from the eyes and arms of government. But defensive measures are not sufficient. In order to gain full protection of one's property from the reaches of government, it is necessary not to remain isolated in one's decision to secede. Not everyone must follow one's example, of course. Indeed, it is not even necessary that a majority of the entire population do so. It is necessary, however, that at least a majority of the population at many separate localities do so, and to reach this critical level of mass withdrawal it is essential to complement one's defensive measures with an offensive strategy, to invest in an ideological campaign of delegitimizing the idea and institution of democratic government among the public. the mass of people, as La Bataille and Mises recognized, always and everywhere consists of brutes, dullards, and of fools, easily deluded and sunk into habitual submission. Thus today, inundated from early childhood with government propaganda in public schools and educational institutions by legions of publicly certified intellectuals, most people mindlessly accept and repeat nonsense such as that democracy is self-rule and government is of, by, and for the people. Even if they can see through this deception, most still unquestioningly accept democratic government on account of the fact that it provides them with a multitude of goods and benefits. Such fools, observed La Bataille, do not realize that they are merely recovering a portion of their own property, and that their ruler could not have given them what they were receiving without having first taken it from them. Thus, every social revolution will necessarily have to begin with just a few uncommon men, the natural elite. This is how La Bataille describes this elite and its role. There are always a few, better endowed than others, who feel the weight of the yoke and cannot restrain themselves from attempting to shake it off. These are the men who never become tamed under subjection, and who always, like Ulysses on land and sea constantly seeking the smoke of his chimney, cannot prevent themselves from peering about for their natural privileges and from remembering their ancestors and their former ways. These are in fact the men who, possessed of clear minds and far-sighted spirit, are not satisfied, like the brutish mass, to see only what is at their feet, but rather look about them, behind and before, and even recall the things of the past in order to judge those of the future, and compare both with their present condition. These are the ones who, having good minds of their own, have further trained them by study and learning. Even if liberty had entirely perished from the earth, such men would invent it. For them slavery has no satisfaction, no matter how well disguised. Just as there can be no revolution without a liberal libertarian elite, however, so can there also be no revolution without some form of mass participation. That is, the elite cannot reach its own goal of restoring private property rights and law and order unless it succeeds in communicating its ideas to the public, openly if possible and secretly if necessary, and awakening the masses from their subservient slumber by arousing, at least temporarily, their natural instinct of wanting to be free. As Mises put it, the flowering of human society depends on two factors: the intellectual power of outstanding men to conceive sound social and economic theories, and the ability of these or other men to make these ideologies palatable to the majority. Hence, the decision by members of the elite to secede from and not cooperate with government must always include the resolve of engaging in, or contributing to, a continuous ideological struggle, for if the power of government rests on the widespread acceptance of false, indeed absurd and foolish ideas, then the only genuine protection is the systematic attack of these ideas and the propagation and proliferation of true ones. Yet just as one must be always cautious and careful regarding one's material investments, it is equally important that one be eternally vigilant and selective in one's ideological investments. In particular, in this endeavor it is not sufficient to merely criticize or support critics and criticisms of specific government policies or personalities, for even if correct and popular, such criticism does not penetrate to the root of the problem. In the terminology of the New Left, it is immanent to the system and thus harmless from the point of view of government. Accordingly, any support given to such efforts, however well intended, is at best wasteful and at worst further increases the power of government. Rather, while criticisms and critics of government may start with specific policies or personalities, or even if they must do so to attract mass attention, everything and everyone worth supporting will have to go further. Every critic and criticism deserving of support must proceed to explain each and every particular government failing as symptomatic of an underlying flaw in the very idea of government itself, and of democratic government in particular. In other words, no critic or criticism is worthy of anyone's support unless it exposes as intellectual fraud the two pillars on which all government power rests: the belief that the protection of private property, unique among all goods, necessitates a compulsory monopoly, a non-voluntary membership organization, and that private property and protection are best secured if entry into this monopoly of law and order is free and its directors are elected democratically. In fact, there must never be even the slightest wavering in one's commitment to uncompromising ideological radicalism, extremism. Not only would anything less be counterproductive, but more importantly, only radical, indeed, radically simple, ideas can possibly stir the emotions of the dull and indolent masses. And nothing is more effective in persuading the masses to cease cooperating with government than the constant and relentless exposure, desanctification, and ridicule of government and its representatives as moral and economic frauds and impostors, as emperors without clothes subject to contempt and the butterful jokes. If and only if the members of the natural liberal libertarian elite have fully grasped this lesson and begin to act accordingly will liberalism have a future. Only then will they have done what La Botille advised us all to do. Resolve to serve no more, and you are at once freed. I do not ask that you place hands upon the tyrant to topple him over, but simply that you support him no longer, then you will behold him, like a great colossus whose pedestal has been pulled away, fall of his own weight and break into pieces. 4. On democracy, redistribution, and the destruction of property. Imagine a world government, democratically elected according to the principle of one man one vote on a worldwide scale. What would the probable outcome of an election be? Most likely, we would get a Chinese-Indian coalition government. And what would this government most likely decide to do in order to satisfy its supporters and be re-elected? The government would probably find that the so-called Western world had far too much wealth and the rest of the world, in particular China and India, far too little, and that a systematic wealth and income redistribution would be necessary. Or imagine that in your own country the right to vote were expanded to 7-year-olds. While the government would not likely be starved of children, its policies would most definitely reflect the legitimate concerns of children to have adequate and equal access to free French fries, lemonade, and videos. With these thought experiments in mind, there can be no doubt about the consequences which resulted from the process of democratization that began in Europe and the US in the second half of the 19th century and has come to fruition since the end of World War I. The successive expansion of the franchise and finally the establishment of universal adult suffrage did within each country what a world democracy would do for the entire globe. It set in motion a seemingly permanent tendency toward wealth and income redistribution. One man one vote combined with free entry into government democracy implies that every person and his personal property comes within reach of and is up for grabs by everyone else. A tragedy of the commons is created. It can be expected that majorities of have-nots will relentlessly try to enrich themselves at the expense of minorities of haves. This is not to say that there will be only one class of have-nots and one class of haves, and that the redistribution will occur uniformly from the rich onto the poor. To the contrary, while the redistribution from rich to poor will always play a prominent role, it would be a sociological blunder to assume that it will be the sole or even the predominant form of redistribution. After all, the permanently rich and the permanently poor are usually rich or poor for a reason. The rich are characteristically bright and industrious, and the poor typically dull, lazy, or both. It is not very likely that dullards, even if they make up a majority, will systematically outsmart and enrich themselves at the expense of a minority of bright and energetic individuals. Rather, most redistribution will take place within the group of the non-poor, and frequently it will actually be the better-off who succeed in having themselves subsidized by the worse-off. Consider, for example, the almost universal practice of offering a free university education, whereby the working class, whose children rarely attend universities, pay through taxation for the education of middle-class children. Moreover, it can be expected that there will be many competing groups and coalitions trying to gain at the expense of others. There will be various changing criteria defining what it is that makes one person a have deserving to be looted and another a have not deserving to receive the loot. At the same time, individuals will be members of a multitude of groups of haves and or have-nots, losing on account of one of their characteristics and gaining on account of another, with some individuals ending up net losers and others net winners of redistribution. The recognition of democracy as a machinery of popular wealth and income redistribution in conjunction with one of the most fundamental principles in all of economics that one will end up getting more of whatever it is that is being subsidized provides the key to understanding the present age. All redistribution, regardless of the criterion on which it is based, involves taking from the original owners and or producers, the havers of something, and giving to non-owners and non-producers, the non-havers of something. The incentive to be an original owner or producer of the thing in question is reduced, and the incentive to be a non-owner and non-producer is raised. Accordingly, as a result of subsidizing individuals because they are poor, there will be more poverty. By subsidizing people because they are unemployed, more unemployment will be created. Supporting single mothers out of tax funds will lead to an increase in single motherhood, illegitimacy, and divorce. In outlawing child labor, income is transferred from families with children to childless persons. As a result of the legal restriction on the supply of labor, wage rates will rise. Accordingly, the birth rate will fall. On the other hand, by subsidizing the education of children, the opposite effect is created. Income is transferred from the childless and those with few children to those with many children. As a result, the birth rate will increase. Yet then the value of children will again fall, and birth rates will decline as a result of the so-called social security system, for in subsidizing retirees, the old, out of taxes imposed on current income earners, the young, the institution of a family, the intergenerational bond between parents, grandparents, and children is systematically weakened. The old need no longer rely on the assistance of their children if they have made no provision for their own old age, and the young, with typically less accumulated wealth, must support the old, with typically more accumulated wealth, rather than the other way around, as is typical within families. Parents' wish for children, and children's wish for parents will decline, family breakups and dysfunctional families will increase, and provisionary action, saving and capital formation will fall, while consumption rises. As a result of subsidizing the malingerers, the neurotics, the careless, the alcoholics, the drug addicts, the AIDS-infected, and the physically and mentally challenged through insurance regulation and compulsory health insurance, there will be more illness, malingering, neuroticism, carelessness, alcoholism, drug addiction, AIDS infection, and physical and mental retardation. By forcing non-criminals, including the victims of crime, to pay for the imprisonment of criminals, rather than making criminals compensate their victims and pay the full cost of their own apprehension and incarceration, crime will increase. By forcing businessmen, through affirmative action non-discrimination programs, to employ more women, homosexuals, blacks, or other minorities than they would like to, there will be more employed minorities and fewer employers and fewer male, heterosexual, and white employment. By compelling private landowners to subsidize, protect endangered species residing on their land through environmental legislation, there will be more and better off animals, and fewer and worse off humans. Most importantly, by compelling private property owners and/or market income earners, producers, to subsidize politicians, political parties, and civil servants. Politicians and government employees do not pay taxes but are paid out of taxes. There will be less wealth formation, fewer producers and less productivity, and ever more waste, parasites, and parasitism. Businessmen, capitalists, and their employees cannot earn an income unless they produce goods or services which are sold in markets. The buyer's purchases are voluntary. By buying a good or service, the buyers, consumers, demonstrate that they prefer this good or service over the sum of money that they must surrender in order to acquire it. In contrast, politicians, parties, and civil servants produce nothing which is sold in markets. No one buys government goods or services. They are produced and costs are incurred to produce them, but they are not sold and bought. On the one hand, this implies that it is impossible to determine their value and find out whether or not this value justifies their costs. Because no one buys them, no one actually demonstrates that he considers government goods and services worth their costs, and indeed, whether or not anyone attaches any value to them at all. From the viewpoint of economic theory, it is thus entirely illegitimate to assume, as is always done in national income accounting, that government goods and services are worth what it costs to produce them, and then to simply add this value to that of the normal, privately produced, bought and sold goods and services to arrive at gross domestic, or national, product, for instance. It might as well be assumed that government goods and services are worth nothing, or even that they are not goods at all but bads, and hence, that the cost of politicians and the entire civil service should be subtracted from the total value of privately produced goods and services. Indeed, to assume this would be far more justified. For on the other hand, as to its practical implications, the subsidizing of politicians and civil servants amounts to a subsidy to produce with little or no regard for the well-being of one's alleged consumers, and with much or sole regard instead for the well-being of the producers, i.e., the politicians and civil servants. Their salaries remain the same, whether their output satisfies consumers or not. Accordingly, as a result of the expansion of public sector employment, there will be increasing laziness, carelessness, incompetence, disservice, maltreatment, waste, and even destruction, and at the same time ever more arrogance, demagoguery, and lies. We work for the public good. After less than 100 years of democracy and redistribution, the predictable results are in. The reserve fund that was inherited from the past is apparently exhausted. For several decades, since the late 1960s or the early 1970s, real standards of living have stagnated or even fallen in the West. The public debt and the cost of the existing social security and health care system have brought on the prospect of an imminent economic meltdown. At the same time, almost every form of undesirable behavior, unemployment, welfare dependency, negligence, recklessness, incivility, psychopathy, hedonism, and crime has increased, and social conflict and societal breakdown have risen to dangerous heights. If current trends continue, it is safe to say that the Western welfare state, social democracy, will collapse just as Eastern, Russian-style socialism collapsed in the late 1980s. However, economic collapse does not automatically lead to improvement. Matters can become worse rather than better. What is necessary besides a crisis are ideas, correct ideas, and men capable of understanding and implementing them once the opportunity arises. Ultimately, the course of history is determined by ideas, be they true or false, and by men acting upon and being inspired by true or false ideas. The current mess is also the result of ideas. It is the result of the overwhelming acceptance, by public opinion, of the idea of democracy. As long as this acceptance prevails, a catastrophe is unavoidable, and there can be no hope for improvement even after its arrival. On the other hand, as soon as the idea of democracy is recognized as false and vicious, and ideas can, in principle, be changed almost instantaneously, a catastrophe can be avoided. The central task of those wanting to turn the tide and prevent an outright breakdown is the delegitimation of the idea of democracy as the root cause of the present state of progressive decivilization. To this purpose, one should first point out that it is difficult to find many proponents of democracy in the history of political theory. Almost all major thinkers had nothing but contempt for democracy. Even the founding fathers of the US, nowadays considered the model of a democracy, were strictly opposed to it. Without a single exception, they thought of democracy as nothing but mob rule. They considered themselves to be members of a natural aristocracy, and rather than a democracy they advocated an aristocratic republic. Furthermore, even among the few theoretical defenders of democracy such as Russo, for instance, it is almost impossible to find anyone advocating democracy for anything but extremely small communities, villages or towns. Indeed, in small communities where everyone knows everyone else personally, most people must acknowledge that the position of the haves is typically based on their superior personal achievement, just as the position of the have-nots finds its typical explanation in their personal deficiencies and inferiority. Under these circumstances, it is far more difficult to get away with trying to loot other people and their personal property to one's advantage. In distinct contrast, in large territories encompassing millions or even hundreds of millions of people, where the potential looters do not know their victims, and vice versa, the human desire to enrich oneself at another's expense is subject to little or no restraint. More importantly, it must be made clear again that the idea of democracy is immoral as well as uneconomical. As for the moral status of majority rule, it must be pointed out that it allows for A and B to band together to rip off C, C and in turn joining to rip off B, and then B and C conspiring against A, and so on. This is not justice but a moral outrage, and rather than treating democracy and Democrats with respect, they should be treated with open contempt and ridiculed as moral frauds. On the other hand, as for the economic quality of democracy, it must be stressed relentlessly that it is not democracy but private property, production, and voluntary exchange that are the ultimate sources of human civilization and prosperity. In particular, contrary to widespread myths, it needs to be emphasized that the lack of democracy had essentially nothing to do with the bankruptcy of Russian-style socialism. It was not the selection principle for politicians that constituted socialism's problem. It was politics and political decision-making as such. Instead of each private producer deciding independently what to do with particular resources, as under a regime of private property and contractualism, with fully or partially socialized factors of production, each decision requires someone else's permission. It is irrelevant to the producer how those giving permission are chosen. What matters to him is that permission must be sought at all. As long as this is the case, the incentive of producers to produce is reduced and impoverishment will ensue. Private property is as incompatible with democracy as it is with any other form of political rule. Rather than democracy, justice as well as economic efficiency require a pure and unrestricted private property society, an anarchy of production in which no one rules anybody and all producers' relations are voluntary and thus mutually beneficial. Russo's social contract, which appeared in 1762, was actually meant to be a theoretical commentary on the political situation in his hometown of Geneva, then an independent city-state of less than 30,000 inhabitants ruled, in effect, by a tiny hereditary oligarchy of the heads of Geneva's leading aristocratic families in control of the small council and the Council of the 200. Russo's appeal to the people and popular sovereignty was intended as an attack on this oligarchy, but by no means as a defense of direct democracy and universal political participation as it is nowadays understood. Rather, what Russo had in mind when he wrote in support of the sovereign people were merely the members of Geneva's other political body, the Grand Council, which was made up of some 1,500 members and included, besides Geneva's upper aristocratic crust, also its lower hereditary aristocracy. Lastly, as for strategic considerations, in order to approach the goal of a non-exploitative social order, i.e., private property anarchy, the idea of majoritarianism should be turned against democratic rule itself. Under any form of governmental rule, including a democracy, the ruling class, politicians and civil servants, represents only a small proportion of the total population. While it is possible that 100 parasites may lead a comfortable life on the products of 1,000 hosts, 1,000 parasites cannot live off of 100 hosts. Based on the recognition of this fact, it would appear possible to persuade a majority of the voters that it is adding insult to injury to let those living off of other people's taxes have a say in how high these taxes are, and to thus decide, democratically, to take the right to vote away from all government employees and everyone who receives government benefits, whether they are welfare recipients or government contractors. In addition, in conjunction with this strategy, it is necessary to recognize the overwhelming importance of secession and secessionist movements. If majority decisions are right, then the largest of all possible majorities, a world majority and a democratic world government, must be considered ultimately right, with the consequences predicted at the outset of this chapter. In contrast, secession always involves the breaking away of smaller from larger populations. It is thus a vote against the principle of democracy and majoritarianism. The further the process of secession proceeds to the level of small regions, cities, city districts, towns, villages, and ultimately individual households and voluntary associations of private households and firms, the more difficult it will become to maintain the current level of redistributive policies. At the same time, the smaller the territorial units, the more likely it will be that a few individuals, based on the popular recognition of their economic independence, outstanding professional achievement, morally impeccable personal life, superior judgment, courage, and taste, will rise to the rank of natural, voluntarily acknowledged elites and lend legitimacy to the idea of a natural order of competing, non-monopolistic and freely, voluntarily financed peacekeepers, judges, and overlapping jurisdictions as exists even now in the arena of international trade and travel. A pure private law society as the answer to democracy and any other form of political, coercive rule. 5. On centralization and secession. A state is a territorial monopolist of compulsion, an agency which may engage in continual, institutionalized property rights violations and the exploitation in the form of expropriation, taxation, and regulation of private property owners. Assuming no more than self-interest on the part of government agents, all states, governments, can be expected to make use of this monopoly and thus exhibit a tendency toward increased exploitation. On the one hand, this means increased domestic exploitation and internal taxation. On the other hand, and this aspect in particular will be of interest in the following, it means territorial expansionism. States will always try to enlarge their exploitation and tax base. In doing so, however, they will come into conflict with other, competing states. The competition between states qua territorial monopolists of compulsion is by its very nature an eliminative competition. That is, there can be only one monopolist of exploitation and taxation in any given area, thus, the competition between different states can be expected to promote a tendency toward increased political centralization and ultimately one single world state. A glance at Western history suffices to illustrate the validity of this conclusion. At the beginning of this millennium, for instance, Europe consisted of thousands of independent political units. Now, only several dozen such units remain. To be sure, decentralizing forces also existed. There was the progressive disintegration of the Ottoman Empire from the 16th century until after World War I and the establishment of modern Turkey. The discontiguous Habsburg Empire was gradually dismembered from the time of its greatest expansion under Charles V until it disappeared and modern Austria was founded in 1918. And only recently, before our very eyes, the former Soviet Empire disintegrated. There are now more than a dozen independent states on the soil of the former Soviet Union. The former Yugoslavia consists now of Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Macedonia, and Bosnia. And the Czechs and the Slovaks have split and formed independent countries. However, the overriding tendency was in the opposite direction. For instance, during the second half of the 17th century, Germany consisted of some 234 countries, 51 free cities, and 1,500 independent knightly manors. By the early 19th century, the total number of the three had fallen to below 50, and by 1871 unification had been achieved. The scenario in Italy was similar. Even small states have a history of expansion and centralization. Switzerland began in 1291 as a confederation of three independent cantonal states. By 1848 it was a single, federal, state with some 24 cantonal provinces. Moreover, from a global perspective, mankind has come closer than ever before to the establishment of a world government. Even before the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, the United States had attained hegemonical status over Western Europe, most notably over West Germany, and the Pacific Rim countries, most notably over Japan, as indicated by the presence of American troops and military bases, by the NATO and SEATO pacts, by the role of the American dollar as the ultimate international reserve currency and of the U.S. Federal Reserve System as the lender, or liquidity provider, of last resort for the entire Western banking system, and by institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the World Bank, and the recently established World Trade Organization, WTO. In addition, under American hegemony the political integration of Western Europe has steadily advanced. With the recent establishment of a European Central Bank and a European currency, Euro, the European Community is near completion. At the same time, with the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, a significant step toward the political integration of the American continent has been taken. In the absence of the Soviet Empire and its military threat, the United States has emerged as the world's sole and undisputed military superpower and its top cop. According to the orthodox view, centralization is generally a good and progressive movement, whereas disintegration and secession, even if sometimes unavoidable, represent an anachronism. It is assumed that larger political units, and ultimately a single world government, imply wider markets and hence increased wealth. As evidence of this, it is pointed out that economic prosperity has increased dramatically with increased centralization. However, rather than reflecting any truth, this orthodox view is more illustrative of the fact that history is typically written by its victors. Correlation or temporal coincidence do not prove causation. In fact, the relationship between economic prosperity and centralization is very different from, and indeed almost the opposite of, what orthodoxy alleges. Political integration, centralization, and economic, market, integration are two completely different phenomena. Political integration involves the territorial expansion of a state's power of taxation and property regulation, expropriation. Economic integration is the extension of the interpersonal and interregional division of labor and market participation. In principle, in taxing and regulating private property owners and market income earners, all governments are counterproductive. They reduce market participation and the formation of economic wealth. Once the existence of a government has been assumed, however, no direct relationship between territorial size and economic integration exists. Switzerland and Albania are both small countries, but Switzerland exhibits a high degree of economic integration, whereas Albania does not. Both the US and the former Soviet Union are large. Yet while there is much division of labor and market participation in the US, there was almost no economic integration in the Soviet Union, where virtually no private capital ownership existed. Centralization, then, can go hand in hand with either economic progress or retrogression. Progress results whenever a less taxing and regulating government expands its territory at the expense of a more exploitative one. If the reverse occurs, centralization implies economic disintegration and retrogression. However, there is a highly important indirect relationship between size and economic integration. A central government ruling over large-scale territories, and even less so a single world government, cannot come into existence ab ovo. Instead, all institutions with the power to tax and regulate owners of private property must start out small. Smallness contributes to moderation, however. A small government has many close competitors, and if it taxes and regulates its own subjects visibly more than its competitors, it is bound to suffer from the emigration of labor and capital and a corresponding loss of future tax revenue. Consider a single household, or a village, as an independent territory, for instance. Could a father do to his son, or a mayor to his village, what the government of the Soviet Union did to its subjects, i.e., deny them any right to private capital ownership, or what governments all across Western Europe and the US do to their citizens, i.e., expropriate up to 50% of their productive output? Obviously not. There would either be an immediate revolt and the government would be overthrown, or immigration to another nearby household or village would ensue. Contrary to orthodoxy, then, precisely the fact that Europe possessed a highly decentralized power structure composed of countless independent political units explains the origin of capitalism, the expansion of market participation, and of economic growth in the Western world. It is not by accident that capitalism first flourished under conditions of extreme political decentralization in the northern Italian city-states, in southern Germany, and in the secessionist Low Countries, Netherlands. The competition among small states for taxable subjects brings them into conflict with each other. As a result of interstate conflicts, historically drawn out over the course of centuries, a few states succeed in expanding their territories, while others are eliminated or incorporated. Which states win in this process of eliminative competition depends on many factors, of course, but in the long run, the decisive factor is the relative amount of economic resources at a government's disposal. Through taxation and regulation, governments do not positively contribute to the creation of economic wealth. Instead, they parasitically draw on existing wealth. However, they can influence the amount of existing wealth negatively. Other things being equal, the lower the tax and regulation burden imposed by a government on its domestic economy, the larger its population tends to grow due to internal reasons as well as immigration factors, and the larger the amount of domestically produced wealth on which it can draw in its conflicts with neighboring competitors. For this reason, centralization is frequently progressive. States which tax and regulate their domestic economies little, liberal states, tend to defeat and expand their territories at the expense of non-liberal ones. This accounts for the outbreak of the Industrial Revolution in centralized England and France. It explains why in the course of the 19th century Western Europe came to dominate the rest of the world, rather than the other way around, and why this colonialism was generally progressive. Furthermore, it explains the rise of the US to the rank of superpower in the course of the 20th century. However, the further the process of more liberal governments defeating less liberal ones proceeds, i.e., the larger the territories, the fewer and more distant the remaining competitors, and thus the more costly international migration, the lower a government's incentive to continue in its domestic liberalism will be. As one approaches the limit of a one-world state, all possibilities of voting with one's feet against a government disappear. Wherever one goes, the same tax and regulation structure applies. Thus relieved of the problem of emigration, a fundamental rein on the expansion of governmental power is gone. This explains developments of the 20th century, with World War I, and even more so with World War II, the US attained hegemony over Western Europe and became heir to its vast colonial empires. A decisive step in the direction of global unification was taken with the establishment of a Pax Americana. And indeed, throughout the entire period the US, Western Europe, and most of the rest of the world have suffered from a steady and dramatic growth of government power, taxation, and regulatory expropriation. In light of social and economic theory and history, then, a case for secession can be made. Initially, secession is nothing more than a shifting of control over the nationalized wealth from a larger, central government to a smaller, regional one. Whether this leads to more or less economic integration and prosperity depends largely on the new regional government's policies. However, the act of secession in itself has a positive impact on production, for one of the most important reasons for secession is typically the belief on the part of the secessionists that they and their territory are being exploited by others. The Slovenes felt, and rightly so, that they were being robbed systematically by the Serbs and the Serbian-dominated Central Yugoslavian government. The Baltic people resented the fact that they had to pay tribute to the Russians and the Russian-dominated government of the Soviet Union. By virtue of secession, hegemonic domestic relations are replaced by contractual, mutually beneficial, foreign relations. Instead of forced integration, there is voluntary separation. Forced integration, as also illustrated by measures such as busing, rent controls, affirmative action, anti-discrimination laws and, as will be explained shortly, free immigration, invariably creates tension, hatred, and conflict. In contrast, voluntary separation leads to harmony and peace. Under forced integration, any mistake can be blamed on a foreign group or culture, and all success claimed as one's own, hence, there is little reason for any culture to learn from another. Under a regime of a separate but equal, one must face up to the reality not only of cultural diversity but in particular of visibly different ranks of cultural advancement. If a secessionist people wishes to improve or maintain its position vis-a-vis a competing one, nothing but discriminative learning will help. It must imitate, assimilate, and, if possible, improve upon the skills, traits, practices, and rules characteristic of more advanced societies, and it must avoid those characteristic of less advanced societies. Rather than promoting a downward leveling of cultures as under forced integration, secession stimulates a cooperative process of cultural selection and advancement. Moreover, while everything else depends on the new regional government's domestic policies and no direct relationship between size and economic integration exists, there is an important indirect connection. Just as political centralization ultimately tends to promote economic disintegration, so secession tends to advance integration and economic development. First, secession always involves the breaking away of a smaller from a larger population, and is thus a vote against the principle of democracy and majoritarian rule in favor of private, decentralized ownership. More importantly, secession always involves increased opportunities for interregional migration, and a secessionist government is immediately confronted with the threat of emigration. To avoid the loss in particular of its most productive subjects, it comes under increased pressure to adopt comparatively liberal domestic policies by allowing more private property and imposing a lower tax and regulation burden than its neighbors. Ultimately, with as many territories as separate households, villages, or towns, the opportunities for economically motivated emigration is maximized and government power over a domestic economy minimized. Specifically, the smaller the country, the greater will be the pressure to opt for free trade rather than protectionism. All government interference with foreign trade forcibly limits the range of mutually beneficial interterritorial exchanges and thus leads to relative impoverishment, at home as well as abroad. But the smaller a territory and its internal markets, the more dramatic this effect will be. A country the size of the US, for instance, might attain comparatively high standards of living even if it renounced all foreign trade, provided it possessed an unrestricted internal capital and consumer goods market. In contrast, if predominantly Serbian cities or counties seceded from surrounding Croatia, and if they pursued the same protectionism, this would likely spell disaster. Consider a single household as the conceivably smallest secessionist unit. By engaging in unrestricted free trade, even the smallest territory can be fully integrated into the world market and partake of every advantage of the division of labor, and its owners may become the wealthiest people on earth. The existence of a single wealthy individual anywhere is living proof of this. On the other hand, if the same household owners decided to forego all interterritorial trade, abject poverty or death would result. Accordingly, the smaller a territory and its internal markets, the more likely it is that it will opt for free trade. Moreover, secession also promotes monetary integration. The process of centralization has also resulted in monetary disintegration, the destruction of the former international commodity, gold, money standard and its replacement with a dollar-dominated system of freely fluctuating government paper monies, i.e., a global, U.S.-led government counterfeiting cartel. However, a system of freely fluctuating paper currencies, the Friedmanite monetarist ideal, is strictly speaking no monetary system at all. It is a system of partial barter, dysfunctional of the very purpose of money of facilitating rather than complicating exchange. This becomes obvious once it is recognized that from the point of view of economic theory, there is no special significance attached to the way national borders are drawn. Yet if one then imagines a proliferation of ever smaller national territories, ultimately to the point where each household forms its own country, Friedman's proposal is revealed for what it is, an outright absurdity. For if every household were to issue its own paper currency, the world would be right back at barter. No one would accept anyone else's paper, economic calculation would be impossible, and trade would come to a virtual standstill. It is only due to centuries of political centralization and the fact that only a relatively small number of countries and national currencies remain, and hence that the disintegrative consequences and calculational difficulties are far less severe, that this could have been overlooked. From this theoretical insight it follows that secession, provided it proceeds far enough, will actually promote monetary integration. In a world of hundreds of thousands of independent political units, each country would have to abandon the current fiat money system which has been responsible for the greatest worldwide inflation in all of human history and once again adopt an international commodity money system such as the gold standard. Secessionism and the growth of separatist and regionalist movements throughout the world represent not an anachronism, but potentially the most progressive historical forces, especially in light of the fact that with the fall of the Soviet Union we have moved closer than ever to the establishment of a new world order. Secession increases ethnic, linguistic, religious, and cultural diversity, while centuries of centralization have stamped out hundreds of distinct cultures. Secession will end the forced integration brought about by centralization, and rather than stimulating social strife and cultural leveling, it will promote the peaceful, cooperative competition of different, territorially separate cultures. In particular, it eliminates the immigration problem increasingly plaguing the countries of Western Europe as well as the US presently. Whenever the central government permits immigration, it allows foreigners to proceed, literally on government-owned roads, to any of its residents' doorsteps, regardless of whether or not these residents desire such proximity to foreigners. Thus, to a large extent, free immigration is forced integration. Secession solves this problem by letting smaller territories each have their own admission standards and determine independently with whom they will associate on their own territory and with whom they prefer to cooperate from a distance. Hence, Rothbard concludes, the more general the money, the greater the scope for division of labor and for the interregional exchange of goods and services that stem from the market economy. A monetary medium is therefore critical to the free market, and the wider the use of this money, the more extensive the market and the better it can function. In short, true freedom of trade does require an international commodity money, gold and silver. Any breakup of such an international medium by statist fiat paper inevitably cripples and disintegrates the free market and robs the world of the fruits of that market. pp. 58-61. Lastly, secession promotes economic integration and development. The process of centralization has resulted in the formation of an international, U.S.-dominated government cartel of managed migration, trade, and fiat money, ever more invasive and burdensome governments, globalized welfare warfare statism, and economic stagnation or even declining standards of living. Secession, if it is extensive enough, could change all this. The world would consist of tens of thousands of distinct countries, regions and cantons, and of hundreds of thousands of independent free cities such as the present-day oddities of Monaco, Andorra, San Marino, Liechtenstein, Hong Kong, and Singapore. Greatly increased opportunities for economically motivated migration would result, and the world would be one of small liberal governments economically integrated through free trade and an international commodity money such as gold. It would be a world of unheard of prosperity, economic growth, and cultural advancement. 6. On socialism and desocialization. Wealth can be brought into existence or increased in three and only three ways: by perceiving certain nature-given things as scarce and actively bringing them into one's possession before anyone else has done so; homesteading, by producing goods with the help of one's labor and such previously appropriated resources; or by acquiring a good through voluntary, contractual transfer from a previous appropriator or producer. Acts of original appropriation turn something which no one had previously perceived as scarce into an income-providing asset. Acts of production are by their very nature aimed at the transformation of a less valuable asset into a more valuable one, and every contractual exchange concerns the exchange and redirection of specific assets from the hands of those who value their possession less to those who value them more. From this it follows that socialism can only lead to impoverishment. First of all, under socialism, ownership of productive assets is assigned to a collective of individuals regardless of each member's prior action or inaction relative to the owned assets. In effect, socialist ownership favors the non-homesteader, the non-producer, and the non-contractor, and disadvantages homesteaders, producers, and contractors. Accordingly, there will be less original appropriation of natural resources whose scarcity is realized, there will be less production of new and less upkeep of old factors of production, and there will be less contracting, for all of these activities involve costs. Under a regime of collective ownership, the cost of performing them is raised, and that of not performing them is lowered. Second, since means of production cannot be sold under socialism, no market prices for factors of production exist. Without such prices, cost accounting is impossible. Inputs cannot be compared with outputs, and it is impossible to decide if their usage for a given purpose is worthwhile or leads to the squandering of scarce resources in the pursuit of projects with relatively little or no importance for consumers. Because he is not permitted to take offers from private individuals who might see an alternative way of using a given means of production, the socialist caretaker of capital goods does not know what his foregone opportunities are. Hence, permanent misallocations of production factors must ensue. Third, even given some initial allocation, since input factors and the output produced are owned collectively, every single producer's incentive to increase the quantity and/or quality of his individual output is systematically diminished, and his incentive to use input factors so as to avoid their over- or underutilization is reduced. Instead, with gains and losses in the socialist firm's capital and sales accounts socialized instead of attributed to specific, individual producers, everyone's inclination toward laziness and negligence is systematically encouraged. Hence, an inferior quality and/or quantity of goods will be produced and permanent capital consumption will ensue. Fourth, under a regime of private property, the person who owns a resource can determine independently of others what to do with it. If he wants to increase his wealth and/or rise in social status, he can only do so by better serving the most urgent wants of voluntary consumers through the use he makes of his property. With collectively owned factors of production, collective decision-making mechanisms are required. Every decision as to what, how, and for whom to produce, how much to pay or charge, and whom to promote or demote, is a political affair. Any disagreement must be settled by superimposing one person's will on another's view, and this invariably creates winners and losers. Hence, if one wants to climb the ladder under socialism, one must resort to one's political talents. It is not the ability to initiate, to work, and to respond to the needs of consumers that assures success. Rather, it is by means of persuasion, demagoguery, and intrigue, through promises, bribes, and threats that one rises to the top. Needless to say, this politicalization of society, implied by any system of collective ownership, contributes even more to impoverishment. II. The manifest bankruptcy of socialism all across Eastern Europe since the late 1980s, after some 70 years of social experimentation, provides a sad illustration of the validity of economic theory. What does the theory that long ago predicted this result as inevitable now imply regarding how Eastern Europe can rise most quickly from the ruins of socialism? Since the ultimate cause of its economic misery is the collective ownership of factors of production, the solution and key to a prosperous future is privatization. Yet how should socialized property be privatized? An elementary yet fundamental moral observation must precede the answer to this question. Since socialism cannot arise without the expropriation of assets originally created and owned by individual homesteaders, producers, and/or contractors, all socialist property, ill-begotten from the very start, should be forfeited. No government, even if freely elected, can be considered the owner of any socialist property, for a criminal's heir, even if himself innocent, does not become the legitimate owner of illegitimately acquired assets. Because of his personal innocence he remains exempt from prosecution, but all of his inherited gains must immediately revert to the original victims, and their repossession of socialist property must take place without their being required to pay anything. In fact, to charge a victimized population a price for the reacquisition of what was originally its own would itself be a crime and would forever take away any innocence that a government previously might have had. More specifically, all original property titles should be recognized immediately, regardless of who presently owns them. Insofar as the claims of original private owners or their heirs clash with those of the current assets users, the former should override the latter. Only if a current user can prove that an original owner's claim is illegitimate, that the title to the property in question had initially been acquired by coercive or fraudulent means, should a user's claim prevail and should he be recognized as the legitimate owner. Regarding socialist property that is not reclaimed in this way, syndicalist ideas should be implemented, that is, the ownership of assets should immediately be transferred to those who use them, the farmland to the farmers, the factories to the workers, the streets to the street workers or the residents, the schools to the teachers, the bureaus to the bureaucrats, and so on. To break up the mostly oversized socialist production conglomerates, the syndicalist principle should be applied to those production units in which a given individual's work is actually performed, i.e., to individual office buildings, schools, streets or blocks of streets, factories and farms. Unlike syndicalism, yet of the utmost importance, the property shares thus acquired should be freely tradable and a stock market established so as to allow a separation of the functions of owner capitalists and non-owning employees, and the smooth and continuous transfer of assets from less into more value-productive hands. The use of syndicalist ideas here is proposed to the very opposite effect, i.e., as a means of privatizing previously socialized factors of production in such cases where no identifiable original, expropriated, private owner of these factors exists. Furthermore, the ethical rationale for the application of the syndicalist slogan in those, and only those, cases lies in the fact that such a privatization scheme approximates most closely the method described by John Locke of the first, original, just appropriation of previously unowned resources. The railwaymen have in fact mixed their labor with the railroads and the miners with the mines. Hence, their claim to these resources must be deemed better founded than anyone else's. Two problems are connected with this privatization strategy. First, what is to be done in the case of newly erected structures which according to the proposed scheme would be owned by their current productive users, built on land that is to revert to a different original owner? While it may appear straightforward enough to award each current producer with an equal property share, how many shares should go to the landowner? Structures and land cannot be physically separated. In terms of economic theory, they are absolutely specific complementary production factors whose relative contribution to their joint value product cannot be disentangled. In this case, there is no alternative but to bargain. This, contrary to the first impression that it might lead to permanent, unresolvable conflict, should hardly cause many headaches, for invariably there are only two parties and strictly limited resources involved in any such dispute. Moreover, to find a quick, mutually agreeable compromise is in both parties' interest, and if either party possesses a weaker bargaining position, it is clearly the landowner, because he cannot sell the land without the structure owner's consent, while they could dismantle the structure without needing the landowner's permission. Second, the syndicalist privatization strategy implies that producers in capital-intensive industries would have a relative advantage as compared to those in labor-intensive industries. The value of the property shares received by the former would exceed the wealth awarded to the latter, and this unequal distribution of wealth would require justification, or so it seems. In fact, such justification is readily available. Contrary to widespread liberal, i.e., social democratic, beliefs, there is nothing ethically wrong with inequality. Indeed, the problem of privatizing formerly socialized property is almost perfectly analogous to that of establishing private property in a state of nature, i.e., when resources are previously unowned. In this situation, according to the central Lockean idea of natural rights which coincides with most people's natural sense of justice, private property is established through acts of homesteading, by mixing one's labor with nature-given resources before anyone else has done so. Insofar as any differences between the quality of nature-given resources exist, as will surely be the case, the outcome generated by the homesteading ethic will be inequality rather than equality. The syndicalist privatization approach is merely the application of this homesteading principle to slightly changed circumstances. The socialized factors of production are already homesteaded by particular individuals. Only their property right regarding particular production factors has been ignored so far, and all that would occur under the proposed scheme is that this unjustifiable situation would finally be rectified. If such rectification results in inequalities, this is no more unfair than the inequalities that would emerge under a regime of original, unadulterated homesteading. Moreover, our syndicalist proposal is economically more efficient than the only conceivable privatization alternative in line with the basic requirement of justice, the recognition that the government does not legitimately own the socialized economy, hence, selling or auctioning it off should be out of the question. According to the latter alternative, the entire population would receive equal shares in all of the country's assets not reclaimed by an original, expropriated owner. Aside from the questionable moral quality of this policy, it would be extremely inefficient. For one thing, in order for such countrywide distributed shares to become tradable property titles, they must specify to which particular resource they refer. Therefore, to implement this proposal, first a complete inventory of all of the country's assets would be required, or at least an inventory of all its distinctively separable production units. Second, even if such an inventory were finally assembled, the owners would consist by and large of individuals who knew next to nothing about the assets they owned. In contrast, under the non-egalitarian syndicalist privatization scheme, no inventory is necessary. Furthermore, initial ownership comes to rest exclusively with individuals who, because of their productive involvement with the assets owned by them, are by and large best informed to make a first realistic appraisal of such assets. In conjunction with the privatization of all assets according to the principles outlined, the government should adopt a private property constitution and declare it to be the immutable basic law for the entire country. This constitution should be extremely brief and lay down the following principles in terms as unambiguous as possible. Every person, apart from being the sole owner of his physical body, has the right to employ his private property in any way he sees fit, so long as in so doing he does not uninvitedly change the physical integrity of another person's body or property. All interpersonal exchanges and all exchanges of property titles between private owners are to be voluntary, contractual. These rights of a person are absolute. Any person's infringement on them is subject to lawful prosecution by the victim of this infringement or his agent, and is actionable in accordance with the principles of the proportionality of punishment and of strict liability. As implied by this Constitution, then, all existing wage and price controls, all property regulations and licensing requirements, and all import and export restrictions should be immediately abolished and complete freedom of contract, occupation, trade and migration introduced. Subsequently, the government, now propertyless, should declare its own continued existence unconstitutional insofar as it depends on non-contractual property acquisitions, that is, taxation, and abdicate. III. The result of this complete abolition of socialism and the establishment of a pure private property society, an anarchy of private property owners, regulated exclusively by private property law, would be the quickest way to economic recovery for Eastern Europe. From the outset, by and large the population would be amazingly rich, for although the economies of Eastern Europe are in shambles, the countries are not destroyed. Real estate values are high, and despite all of the capital consumption of the past there are still massive amounts of capital goods in existence. With no government sector left and the entire national wealth in private hands, the people of Eastern Europe could soon become objects of envy among their West European counterparts. Moreover, releasing factors of production from political control and handing them over to private individuals who are allowed to use them as they see fit as long as they do not physically damage the resources owned by others provides the ultimate stimulus for future production. With an unrestricted market for capital goods, rational cost accounting becomes possible. With profits as well as losses individualized and reflected in an owner's capital and sales account, every single producer's incentive to increase the quantity and/or quality of his output and to avoid any over or underutilization of his capital is maximized. In particular, the constitutional provision that only the physical integrity of property, not property values, be protected guarantees that every owner will undertake the greatest value-productive efforts to promote favorable changes in property values and to prevent and counter any unfavorable ones as might result from another person's actions regarding his property. Specifically, the abolishment of all price controls eliminate almost instantaneously all present shortages, and output would begin to increase immediately, both quantitatively as well as qualitatively. Unemployment would drastically increase temporarily, yet with flexible wage rates, without collective bargaining, and without unemployment subsidies it would quickly disappear. Initially, average wage rates would remain substantially below Western rates, but this, too, would soon change. Lured by comparatively low wages, by the fact that East Europeans will expectedly show a great need for cashing in, liquidating their newly acquired capital assets so as to finance their current consumption, and above all by the fact that East Europe would be a no-tax, free trade haven, large numbers of investors and huge amounts of capital would begin to flow in immediately. The production of security, of police protection, and of a judicial system, which is usually assumed to lie outside the province of free markets and be the proper function of government, would most likely be taken over by major Western insurance companies. Providing insurance for personal property, police action, the prevention and detection of crime as well as the exaction of compensation is in fact part of this industry's natural business if it were not for governments preventing insurers from doing so and arrogating this task to itself, with all the usual and familiar inefficiencies resulting from such a monopolization. Likewise, being already in the business of arbitrating conflicts between claimants of competing insurers, insurance companies would naturally assume the function of a judicial system. Yet more important than the entrance of big business, such as insurance companies into the field of security production, would be the influx of large numbers of small entrepreneurs, in particular from Western Europe. Facing a heavy tax burden in the welfare states of Western Europe as well as being stifled there by countless regulations, licensing requirements, labor protection laws, mandated working and shop opening hours, an unregulated private property economy in Eastern Europe would be an almost irresistible attraction. Soon the large-scale influx of entrepreneurial talent and capital would begin to raise real wage rates, stimulate internal savings, and lead to a rapidly accelerating process of capital accumulation. Rather than leaving the East, migration would quickly take place in the opposite direction, with increasing numbers of Western Europeans abandoning welfare socialism for the unlimited opportunities offered in the East. Finally, faced with increasing losses of productive individuals, which would put even more pressure on their welfare budgets, the power elites of Western Europe would be forced to begin desocializing Western Europe as well. IV. Postscript on privatization in welfare states. While it should be clear from the foregoing considerations why from a moral as well as an economic point of view the Western welfare states require as thorough a reform as the former socialist countries of Eastern Europe, it is important to note that the method of privatization must be different in both cases. The syndicalist privatization strategy proposed for formerly socialist countries applied, as will be recalled, only in such cases where no identifiable previously expropriated private owner or of socialized factors of production existed. If such an owner could be identified, then he should be again installed as private owner. If and only if no such owner existed could it be considered just to install the current and or past users of socialized production factors as their private owners, because they and only they have then an objectifiable, i.e., intersubjectively ascertainable, tie to these resources. Only they, of all people, have de facto homesteaded the factors of production in question. Thus, only their ownership claim can be said to have any real objective foundation. By the same token, it would be without any real foundation whatsoever, and thus utterly indefensible from a moral point of view if private ownership in the publicly owned production factors of the mixed, welfare state economies of the Western world were assigned to public sector employees, i.e., the so-called civil servants, along the line of the syndicalist slogan, the public schools to the teachers, the universities to the professors, the post offices to the postal workers, the public land to the bureaucrats of the Bureau of Land Management, the courthouses and police stations to the judges and policemen, etc. Indeed, to do so would constitute nothing less than a moral outrage, even in the rather typical case where the public property in question is not the result of a prior expropriation of some formerly private owner of this property by means of the government's power of eminent domain, in which case the property should be simply returned to the original owner. Even in this case, all public property is still the result of some form of expropriation, and although the proper identification of the victims of this expropriation is more difficult than in the clear-cut case of eminent domain, it is by no means impossible. In any case, it is obvious that civil servants are typically not among the victims. Hence, they of all people have the least well-founded claim to private ownership of this property. Publicly owned buildings and structures were all financed by taxes, and as far as undeveloped public land is concerned, it is the result of a public, i.e., tax-funded and enforced, policy prohibiting the private appropriation and development of nature and natural resources. Hence, it would appear that it is taxpayers, in accordance with their amount of taxes paid, who should be given title to public buildings and structures, while undeveloped public land simply should be opened up to private homesteading. Keep in mind that civil servants are not taxpayers, even though, in public discourse, they frequently fancy themselves to be so. Rather, their net income is typically paid out of taxes paid by other individuals working in the private sector of the economy. Civil servants are tax consumers, just as public welfare recipients are tax consumers rather than taxpayers. Hence, civil servants as well as welfare recipients should be excluded from private ownership in formerly public buildings and structures. Both civil servants and welfare recipients live off other people's tax payments, and it would add insult to injury if they, instead of those who had paid their salaries and handouts as well as the public buildings and structures that they occupy and control, should be awarded ownership of these buildings and structures. As regards undeveloped public land available for private homesteading activities, every public land manager, ranger, etc. should be excluded for a similar reason from homesteading land currently occupied and formally guarded by him against potential private developers. He may be permitted to homestead other public land that is presently occupied and formally guarded against private development by other government agents. But to allow him to homestead land he currently occupies would give him an advantage over other potential homesteaders that would be manifestly unfair in light of the fact that it was he, paid in this by taxpayers, who had previously kept these taxpayers off and away from this land. 7. On free immigration and forced integration. The classical argument in favor of free immigration runs as follows: other things being equal, businesses go to low-wage areas and labor moves to high-wage areas, thus affecting a tendency toward the equalization of wage rates for the same kind of labor, as well as the optimal localization of capital. An influx of migrants into a given sized high-wage area will lower nominal wage rates. However, it will not lower real wage rates if the population is below its optimum size. To the contrary, if this is the case, the produced output will increase overproportionally and real incomes will actually rise. Thus, restrictions on immigration will harm the protected domestic workers qua consumers more than they gain qua producers. Moreover, immigration restrictions will increase the flight of capital abroad, the export of capital which otherwise might have stayed, still causing an equalization of wage rates, although somewhat more slowly, but leading to a less than optimal allocation of capital, thereby harming world living standards all around. In addition, traditionally labor unions, and nowadays environmentalists, are opposed to free immigration, and this should prima facie count as another argument in favor of a policy of free immigration. II. As it is stated, the above argument in favor of free immigration is irrefutable. It would be foolish to attack it, just as it would be foolish to deny that free trade leads to higher living standards than does protectionism. It would also be wrong to attack the above case for free immigration by pointing out that because of the existence of a welfare state, immigration has become to a significant extent the immigration of welfare bums, who do not increase but rather decrease average living standards even if the United States, for instance, is below her optimal population point. For this is not an argument against immigration but against the welfare state. To be sure, the welfare state should be destroyed in its entirety. However, the problems of immigration and welfare are analytically distinct problems and must be treated accordingly. The problem with the above argument is that it suffers from two interrelated shortcomings which invalidate its unconditional pro-immigration conclusion and/or which render the argument applicable only to a highly unrealistic, long bygone situation in human history. The first shortcoming will only be touched upon. To libertarians of the Austrian school, it should be clear that what constitutes wealth and well-being is subjective. Material wealth is not the only thing that has value. Thus, even if real incomes rise due to immigration, it does not follow that immigration must be considered good, for one might prefer lower living standards and a greater distance to other people over higher living standards and a smaller distance to others. Instead, a second, related shortcoming will be the focus here. With regard to a given territory into which people immigrate, it is left unanalyzed who, if anyone, owns, controls this territory. In fact, in order to render the above argument applicable, it is implicitly assumed that the territory in question is unowned and that the immigrants enter virgin territory, open frontier. Obviously, today this can no longer be assumed. If this assumption is dropped, however, the problem of immigration takes on an entirely new meaning and requires fundamental rethinking. For the purpose of illustration, let us first assume an anarcho-capitalist society. Though convinced that such a society is the only social order that can be defended as just, I do not want to explain here why this is the case. Instead, I will employ it as a conceptual benchmark, because this will help explain the fundamental misconception of most contemporary free immigration advocates. All land is privately owned, including all streets, rivers, airports, harbors, and so on. With respect to some pieces of land, the property title may be unrestricted, that is, the owner is permitted to do with his property whatever he pleases as long as he does not physically damage the property owned by others. With respect to other territories, the property title may be more or less severely restricted. As is currently the case in some housing developments, the owner may be bound by contractual limitations on what he can do with his property, voluntary zoning, which might include residential versus commercial use, no buildings more than 4 stories high, no sale or rent to Jews, Germans, Catholics, homosexuals, Haitians, families with or without children, or smokers, for example. Clearly, under this scenario no such thing as freedom of immigration exists. Rather, many independent private property owners have the freedom to admit or exclude others from their own property in accordance with their own unrestricted or restricted property titles. Admission to some territories might be easy, while it might be nearly impossible to others. In any case, however, admission to the property of the admitting person does not imply a freedom to move around unless other property owners consent to such movement. There will be as much immigration or non-immigration, inclusivity or exclusivity, desegregation or segregation, non-discrimination or discrimination based on racial, ethnic, linguistic, religious, cultural or whatever other grounds as individual owners or associations of individual owners allow. Note that none of this, not even the most exclusive form of segregationism, has anything to do with a rejection of free trade and the adoption of protectionism. From the fact that one does not want to associate with or live in the neighborhood of blacks, Turks, Catholics or Hindus, etc., it does not follow that one does not want to trade with them from a distance. To the contrary, it is precisely the absolute voluntariness of human association and separation, the absence of any form of forced integration, that makes peaceful relationships, free trade, between culturally, racially, ethnically, or religiously distinct people possible. IV. In an anarcho-capitalist society there is no government and, accordingly, no clear-cut distinction between inlanders, domestic citizens, and foreigners. This distinction only arises with the establishment of a government, i.e., an institution which possesses a territorial monopoly of aggression, taxation. The territory over which a government's taxing power extends becomes inland, and everyone residing outside of this territory becomes a foreigner. State borders and passports are an unnatural, coercive institution. Indeed, their existence and that of a domestic government implies a twofold distortion with respect to people's natural inclination to associate with others. First, inlanders cannot exclude the government, the taxman, from their own property and are subject to what one might call forced integration by government agents. Second, in order to be able to intrude on its subjects' private property so as to tax them, a government must invariably have control of existing roads, and it will employ its tax revenue to produce even more roads to gain even better access to all private property qua potential tax source. This overproduction of roads does not result merely in the innocent facilitation of interregional trade, a lowering of transaction costs, as starry-eyed economists would have us believe, but leads to forced domestic integration, artificial desegregation of separate localities. Moreover, with the establishment of a government and state borders, immigration takes on an entirely new meaning. Immigration becomes immigration by foreigners across state borders, and the decision as to whether or not a person should be admitted no longer rests with private property owners or associations of such owners, but with the government as the ultimate sovereign of all domestic residents and the ultimate superowner of all their properties. Now, if the government excludes a person while even one domestic resident wants to admit this very person onto his property, the result is forced exclusion, a phenomenon that does not exist under private property anarchism. Furthermore, if the government admits a person while there is not a single domestic resident who wants to have this person on his property, the result is forced integration, also non-existent under private property anarchism. V. It is time to enrich the analysis through the introduction of a few realistic empirical assumptions. Let us assume that the government is privately owned. The ruler owns the entire country within state borders. He owns part of the territory outright, his property title is unrestricted, and he is partial owner of the rest as landlord or residual claimant of all of his citizen tenants' real estate holdings, albeit restricted by some pre-existing rental contracts. He can sell and bequeath his property, and he can calculate and capture the monetary value of his capital, his country. Traditional monarchies and kings are the closest historical examples of this form of government. What will a king's typical immigration and emigration policy be? Because he owns the entire country's capital value, he will tend to choose migration policies that preserve or enhance rather than diminish the value of his kingdom, assuming no more than his self-interest. As far as emigration is concerned, a king would want to prevent the emigration of productive subjects, in particular of his best and most productive subjects, because losing them would lower the value of the kingdom. Thus, for example, from 1782 until 1824 a law prohibited the emigration of skilled workmen from Britain. On the other hand, a king would want to expel his non-productive and destructive subjects, criminals, bums, beggars, gypsies, vagabonds, etc., for their removal from his territory would increase the value of his realm. For this reason Britain expelled tens of thousands of common criminals to North America and Australia. On the other hand, as far as immigration policy is concerned, a king would want to keep the mob, as well as all people of inferior productive capabilities, out. People of the latter category would only be admitted temporarily as seasonal workers without citizenship, and they would be barred from permanent property ownership. Thus, for example, after 1880 large numbers of Poles were hired as seasonal workers in Germany. A king would only permit the permanent immigration of superior or at least above average people, i.e., those whose residence in his kingdom would increase his own property value. Thus, for example, after 1685, with the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, tens of thousands of Huguenots were permitted to settle in Prussia, and similarly Peter the Great, Frederick the Great, and Maria Theresa later promoted the immigration and settlement of large numbers of Germans in Russia, Prussia, and the eastern provinces of Austria-Hungary. In brief, while through his immigration policies a king might not entirely avoid all cases of forced exclusion or forced integration, such policies would by and large do the same as what private property owners would do if they could decide whom to admit and whom to exclude. That is, the king would be highly selective and very much concerned about improving the quality of the resident human capital so as to drive property values up rather than down. 6. Migration policies become predictably different once the government is publicly owned. The ruler no longer owns the country's capital value but only has current use of it. He cannot sell or bequeath his position as ruler, he is merely a temporary caretaker. Moreover, free entry into the position of a caretaker government exists. In principle, anyone can become the ruler of the country. As they came into existence on a worldwide scale after World War I, democracies offer historical examples of public government. What are a democracy's migration policies? Once again, assuming no more than self-interest, maximizing monetary and psychic income, money and power, democratic rulers tend to maximize current income, which they can appropriate privately, at the expense of capital values, which they cannot appropriate privately. Hence, in accordance with democracy's inherent egalitarianism of one man, one vote, they tend to pursue a distinctly egalitarian, non-discriminatory, emigration and immigration policy. As far as emigration policy is concerned, this implies that for a democratic ruler it makes little, if any, difference whether productive or unproductive people, geniuses or bums leave the country. They all have one equal vote. In fact, democratic rulers might well be more concerned about the loss of a bum than that of a productive genius. While the loss of the latter would obviously lower the capital value of the country and loss of the former might actually increase it, a democratic ruler does not own the country. In the short run, which is of the most interest to a democratic ruler, the bum, voting most likely in favor of egalitarian measures, might be more valuable than the productive genius who, as egalitarianism's prime victim, will more likely vote against the democratic ruler. For the same reason, quite unlike a king, a democratic ruler undertakes little to actively expel those people whose presence within the country constitutes a negative externality, human trash which drives individual property values down. In fact, such negative externalities, unproductive parasites, bums, and criminals, are likely to be his most reliable supporters. As far as immigration policies are concerned, the incentives and disincentives are likewise distorted, and the results are equally perverse. For a democratic ruler, it also matters little whether bums or geniuses, below or above average civilized and productive people immigrate into the country. Nor is he much concerned about the distinction between temporary workers, owners of work permits, and permanent, property-owning immigrants, naturalized citizens. In fact, bums and unproductive people may well be preferred as residents and citizens because they create more so-called social problems, and democratic rulers thrive on the existence of such problems. Moreover, bums and inferior people will likely support his egalitarian policies, whereas geniuses and superior people will not. The result of this policy of non-discrimination is forced integration, the forcing of masses of inferior immigrants onto domestic property owners who, if the decision were left to them, would have sharply discriminated and chosen very different neighbors for themselves. Thus, as the best available example of democracy at work, the United States immigration laws of 1965 eliminated all previous quality concerns and the explicit preference for European immigrants, replacing them with a policy of almost complete non-discrimination, multiculturalism. Indeed, the immigration policy of a democracy is the mirror image of its policy toward internal population movements, toward the voluntary association and dissociation, segregation and desegregation, and the physical distancing and approximating of various private property owners. Like a king, a democratic ruler promotes spatial over-integration by overproducing the public good of roads. However, for a democratic ruler, unlike a king, it will not be sufficient that everyone can move next door to anyone else on government roads. Concerned about his current income and power rather than capital values and constrained by egalitarian sentiments, a democratic ruler will tend to go even further. Through non-discrimination laws, one cannot discriminate against Germans, Jews, blacks, Catholics, Hindus, homosexuals, etc. The government will want to increase the physical access and entrance to everyone's property to everyone else. Thus, it is hardly surprising that the so-called civil rights legislation in the United States, which outlawed domestic discrimination on the basis of color, race, national origin, religion, gender, age, sexual orientation, disability, etc., and which thereby actually mandated forced integration, coincided with the adoption of a non-discriminatory immigration policy, i.e., Mandated international desegregation, forced integration. 7. The current situation in the United States and in Western Europe has nothing whatsoever to do with free immigration. It is forced integration, plain and simple, and forced integration is the predictable outcome of democratic one-man, one-vote rule. Abolishing forced integration requires the de-democratization of society and ultimately the abolition of democracy. More specifically, the power to admit or exclude should be stripped from the hands of the central government and reassigned to the states, provinces, cities, towns, villages, residential districts, and ultimately to private property owners and their voluntary associations. The means to achieve this goal are decentralization and secession, both inherently undemocratic and anti-majoritarian. One would be well on the way toward a restoration of the freedom of association and exclusion as is implied in the idea and institution of private property, and much of the social strife currently caused by forced integration would disappear if only towns and villages could and would do what they did as a matter of course until well into the 19th century in Europe and the United States, to post signs regarding entrance requirements to the town and once in town for entering specific pieces of property, no beggars, bums, or homeless, but also no Muslims, Hindus, Jews, Catholics, etc., to expel as trespassers those who do not fulfill these requirements, and to solve the naturalization question somewhat along the Swiss model, where local assemblies, not the central government, determine who can and who cannot become a Swiss citizen. What should one advocate as the relatively correct immigration policy, however, as long as the democratic central state is still in place and successfully arrogates the power to determine a uniform national immigration policy? The best one may hope for, even if it goes against the nature of a democracy and thus is not very likely to happen, is that the democratic rulers act as if they were the personal owners of the country and as if they had to decide who to include and who to exclude from their own personal property into their very own houses. This means following a policy of the strictest discrimination in favor of the human qualities of skill, character, and cultural compatibility. More specifically, it means distinguishing strictly between citizens, naturalized immigrants, and resident aliens and excluding the latter from all welfare entitlements. It means requiring, for resident alien status as well as for citizenship, the personal sponsorship by a resident citizen and his assumption of liability for all property damage caused by the immigrant. It implies requiring an existing employment contract with a resident citizen. Moreover, for both categories but especially that of citizenship, it implies that all immigrants must demonstrate through tests not only English language proficiency, but all-around superior, above-average, intellectual performance and character structure as well as a compatible system of values, with the predictable result of a systematic pro-European immigration bias. 8. On free trade and restricted immigration. It is frequently maintained that free trade is connected with free immigration, as is protectionism with restricted immigration. That is, the claim is made that while it is not impossible that someone might combine protectionism with free immigration or free trade with restricted immigration, these positions are intellectually inconsistent and thus erroneous. Hence, insofar as people seek to avoid errors, they should be the exception rather than the rule. The facts, insofar as they have a bearing on the issue, appear to be consistent with this claim. As the last Republican presidential primaries indicated, for instance, most professed free traders are advocates of relatively free and non-discriminatory immigration policies, while most protectionists are proponents of highly restrictive and selective immigration policies. Appearances to the contrary notwithstanding, I will argue that this thesis and its implicit claim are fundamentally wrong. In particular, I will demonstrate that free trade and restricted immigration are not only perfectly consistent but even mutually reinforcing policies. That is, it is not the advocates of free trade and restricted immigration who are wrong, but rather the proponents of free trade and free immigration. In taking the intellectual guilt out of the free trade and restricted immigration position and putting it where it actually belongs, I hope to promote a change in current public opinion and facilitate substantial political realignments. Since the days of Ricardo, the case for free trade has been logically unassailable. For the sake of argumentative thoroughness, it would be useful to summarize it briefly. The restatement will be in the form of a reductio ad absurdum of the protectionist thesis as proposed most recently by Patrick Buchanan. The central argument advanced in favor of protectionism is one of domestic job protection. How can American producers paying their workers $10 per hour possibly compete with Mexican producers paying $1 or less per hour? They cannot, and American jobs will be lost unless import tariffs are imposed to insulate American wages from Mexican competition. Free trade is only possible between countries that have equal wage rates and thus compete on a level playing field. As long as this is not the case, as with the US and Mexico, the playing field must be made level by means of tariffs. As for the consequences of such a policy of domestic job protection, Buchanan and his fellow protectionists claim that it will lead to domestic strength and prosperity, and in support of this claim, examples are cited of free trade countries that lost their once preeminent international economic position, such as 19th century England, and of protectionist countries which gained such preeminence, such as 19th century America. This or any other alleged empirical proof of the protectionist thesis must be rejected out of hand as containing a post hoc, ergo propter hoc fallacy. The inference drawn from historical data is no more convincing than if one were to conclude from the observation that rich people consume more than poor people that it must be consumption that makes a person rich. Indeed, protectionists such as Buchanan characteristically fail to understand what is actually involved in defending their thesis. Any argument in favor of international protectionism rather than free trade is simultaneously an argument in favor of interregional and interlocal protectionism. Just as different wage rates exist between the United States and Mexico, Haiti, or China, for instance, such differences also exist between New York and Alabama, or between Manhattan, the Bronx, and Harlem. Thus, if it were true that international protectionism could make an entire nation prosperous and strong, it must also be true that interregional and interlocal protectionism could make regions and localities prosperous and strong. In fact, one may even go one step further. If the protectionist argument were right, it would amount to an indictment of all trade and a defense of the thesis that everyone would be the most prosperous and strongest if he never traded with anyone else and remained in self-sufficient isolation. Certainly, in this case no one would ever lose his job, and unemployment due to unfair competition would be reduced to zero. In thus deducing the ultimate implication of the protectionist argument, its complete absurdity is revealed, for such a full employment society would not be prosperous and strong, it would be composed of people who, despite working from dawn to dusk, would be condemned to poverty and destitution or death from starvation. International protectionism, while obviously less destructive than a policy of interpersonal or interregional protectionism, would have precisely the same effect and be a recipe for America's further economic decline. To be sure, some American jobs and industries would be saved, but such savings would come at a price. The standard of living and the real income of the American consumers of foreign products would be forcibly reduced. The cost to all United States producers who use the protected industry's products as their own input factors would be raised, and they would be rendered less competitive internationally. Moreover, what could foreigners do with the money they earned from their U.S. imports? They could either buy American goods, or they could leave it in the U.S. and invest it, and if their imports were stopped or reduced, they would buy fewer American goods or invest smaller amounts. Hence, as a result of saving a few inefficient American jobs, a far greater number of efficient American jobs would be destroyed or never come into existence. Thus, it is nonsense to claim that England lost its former preeminence because of its free trade policies. It lost its position despite its free trade policy, and because of the socialist policies which took hold in England during the last third of the 19th century. Likewise, it is nonsense to claim that the rise of the United States to economic preeminence in the course of the 19th century was due to its protectionist policies. The United States attained this position despite its protectionism, and because of its unrivaled internal laissez-faire policies. Indeed, America's current economic decline, which Buchanan would want to halt and reverse, is not the result of her alleged free trade policies, but of the circumstance that America, in the course of the 20th century, gradually adopted the same socialist policies that had ruined England earlier. Given the case for free trade, we will now develop the case for immigration restrictions to be combined with free trade policies. More specifically, we will build a successively stronger case for immigration restrictions from the initial weak claim that free trade and immigration restrictions can be combined and do not exclude each other to the final strong claim that the principle underlying free trade actually requires such restrictions. From the outset, it must be emphasized that not even the most restrictive immigration policy or the most exclusive form of segregationism has anything to do with a rejection of free trade and the adoption of protectionism. From the fact that one does not want to associate with or live in a neighborhood of Germans, Haitians, Chinese, Koreans, Mexicans, Muslims, Hindus, Catholics, etc., it does not follow that one does not want to trade with them from a distance. Moreover, even if it were the case that one's real income would rise as a result of immigration, it does not follow that immigration must be considered good, for material wealth is not the only thing that matters. Rather, what constitutes welfare and wealth is subjective, and one might prefer lower material living standards and a greater distance from certain other people over higher material living standards and a smaller distance. It is precisely the absolute voluntariness of human association and separation, the absence of any form of forced integration, which makes peaceful relationships, free trade, between racially, ethnically, linguistically, religiously, or culturally distinct people possible. The relationship between trade and migration is one of elastic substitutability rather than rigid exclusivity. The more, less you have of one, the less, more you need of the other. Other things being equal, businesses move to low-wage areas and labor moves to high-wage areas, thus affecting a tendency toward the equalization of wage rates for the same kind of labor, as well as the optimal localization of capital. With political borders separating high from low-wage areas, and with nationwide trade and immigration policies in effect, these normal tendencies of immigration and capital export are weakened with free trade and strengthened with protectionism. As long as Mexican products, the products of a low-wage area, can freely enter a high-wage area such as the United States, the incentive for Mexican people to move to the United States is reduced. In contrast, if Mexican products are prevented from entering the American market, the attraction for Mexican workers to move to the United States is increased. Similarly, when United States producers are free to buy from and sell to Mexican producers and consumers, capital exports from the United States to Mexico will be reduced. However, when United States producers are prevented from doing so, the attraction of moving production from the United States to Mexico is increased. Similarly, as the foreign trade policy of the United States affects immigration, so does its domestic trade policy. Domestic free trade is what is typically referred to as laissez-faire capitalism. In other words, the national government follows a policy of non-interference with the voluntary transactions between domestic parties, citizens regarding their private property. The government's policy is one of helping to protect its citizens and their private property from domestic aggression, damage, or fraud, exactly as in the case of foreign trade and aggression. If the United States followed strict domestic free trade policies, immigration from low-wage regions such as Mexico would be reduced, while when it pursues social welfare policies, immigration from low-wage areas is more attractive. IV. To the extent that a high-wage area such as the United States engages in unrestricted free trade, internationally as well as domestically, the immigration pressure from low-wage countries will be kept low or reduced, and hence, the question as to what to do about immigration will be less urgent. On the other hand, insofar as the United States engages in protectionist policies against the products of low-wage areas products and in welfare policies at home, immigration pressure will be kept high or even raised, and the immigration question will assume great importance in public debate. Obviously, the world's major high-wage regions, North America and Western Europe, are presently in this latter situation, in which immigration has become an increasingly urgent public concern. In light of steadily mounting immigration pressure from the world's low-wage regions, three general strategies of dealing with immigration have been proposed: unconditional free immigration, conditional free immigration, and restrictive immigration. While our main concern will be with the latter two alternatives, a few observations regarding the unconditional free immigration position are appropriate, if only to illustrate the extent of its intellectual bankruptcy and irresponsibility. According to proponents of unconditional free immigration, the United States qua high-wage area would invariably benefit from free immigration, hence, it should enact a policy of open borders, regardless of present conditions, i.e., even if the United States were entangled in protectionism and domestic welfare. Surely, such a proposal must strike a reasonable person as fantastic. Assume that the United States, or better still Switzerland, declared that there would no longer be any border controls, that anyone who could pay the fare might enter the country, and, as a resident, would then be entitled to every normal domestic welfare provision. Is there any doubt about the disastrous outcome of such an experiment in the present world? The United States, and even faster Switzerland, already weakened by protectionism and welfare, would be overrun by millions of third-world immigrants. Welfare costs would quickly skyrocket, and the strangled economy would disintegrate and collapse as the subsistence fund, the stock of capital accumulated in and inherited from the past, fathers and forefathers, was plundered. Civilization would vanish from the United States and Switzerland, just as it once did from Greece and Rome. Since unconditional free immigration must be regarded as a prescription for societal suicide, the typical position among free traders is the alternative of conditional free immigration. According to this view, the United States and Switzerland would have to first return to unrestricted free trade and abolish all tax-funded welfare programs, and only then could they open their borders to everyone who wanted to come. In the meantime, while the welfare state is still in place, immigration would be permitted subject to the condition that immigrants are excluded from domestic welfare entitlements. While the error involved in this view is less obvious and the consequences less dramatic than those associated with the unconditional free immigration position, the view is nonetheless erroneous and harmful. To be sure, the immigration pressure on the United States and Switzerland would be reduced if this proposal were followed, but it would not disappear. Indeed, with foreign and domestic free trade policies, wage rates within the United States and Switzerland might further increase relative to those at other locations with less enlightened economic policies. Hence, the attraction of both countries might even increase. In any case, some immigration pressure would remain, so some form of immigration policy would have to exist. Do the principles underlying free trade imply that this policy must be one of conditional free immigration? No, they do not. There is no analogy between free trade and free immigration, and restricted trade and restricted immigration. The phenomena of trade and immigration are different in one fundamental respect, and the meaning of free and restricted in conjunction with both terms is categorically different. People can move and migrate, goods and services of themselves cannot. Put differently, while someone can migrate from one place to another without anyone else wanting him to do so, goods and services cannot be shipped from place to place unless both sender and receiver agree. Trivial as this distinction may appear, it has momentous consequences, for free in conjunction with trade means trade by invitation of private households and firms only, and restricted trade does not mean protection of households and firms from uninvited goods or services, but invasion and abrogation of the right of private households and firms to extend or deny invitations to their own property. In contrast, free in conjunction with immigration does not mean immigration by invitation of individual households and firms, but unwanted invasion or forced integration, and restricted immigration actually means, or at least can mean, the protection of private households and firms from unwanted invasion and forced integration. Hence, in advocating free trade and restricted immigration, one follows the same principle of requiring an invitation for people as for goods and services. The free trade and free market proponent who adopts the conditional free immigration position is involved in intellectual inconsistency. Free trade and markets mean that private property owners may receive or send goods from and to other owners without government interference. The government stays inactive vis-a-vis the process of foreign and domestic trade because a paying recipient exists for every good or service sent. Hence, every locational change, as the outcome of an agreement between sender and receiver, must be deemed mutually beneficial. The government's sole function is that of maintaining the very trading process by protecting citizen and domestic property. However, with respect to the movement of people, the same government will have to do more to fulfill its protective function than merely permit events to take their own course because people, unlike products, possess a will and can migrate. Accordingly, population movements, unlike product shipments, are not per se mutually beneficial events because they are not always, necessarily and invariably, the result of an agreement between a specific receiver and sender. There can be shipments, immigrants, without willing domestic recipients. In this case, immigrants are foreign invaders and immigration represents an act of invasion. Surely, a government's basic protective function would include the prevention of foreign invasions and the expulsion of foreign invaders. Just as surely then, in order to do so and subject immigrants to the same requirement as imports of having to be invited by domestic residents, a government cannot rightfully allow the kind of free immigration advocated by most free traders. Just imagine again that the United States and Switzerland threw their borders open to whoever wanted to come, provided only that immigrants be excluded from all welfare entitlements which would be reserved for United States and Swiss citizens respectively. Apart from the sociological problem of thereby creating two distinct classes of domestic residents and thus causing severe social tensions, there is little doubt about the outcome of this experiment in the present world. The result would be less drastic and less immediate than under the scenario of unconditional free immigration, but it would also amount to a massive foreign invasion and ultimately lead to the destruction of American and Swiss civilization. Even if no welfare handouts were available to immigrants, this does not mean that they would actually have to work, since even life on and off the public streets and parks in the United States and Switzerland is comfortable as compared to real life in many other areas of the world. Thus, in order to fulfill its primary function as the protector of its citizens and their domestic property, a high-wage area government cannot follow an immigration policy of laissez-passer, but must engage in restrictive measures. From the recognition that proponents of free trade and markets cannot advocate free immigration without being inconsistent and contradicting themselves, and that therefore immigration must logically be restricted, it is but a small step to the further recognition of how it must be restricted. In fact, all high-wage area governments presently restrict immigration in one way or another. Nowhere is immigration free, unconditionally or conditionally. However, the restrictions imposed on immigration by the United States and by Switzerland, for instance, are quite different. Which restrictions should exist? More precisely, which immigration restrictions is a free trader and free marketeer logically compelled to uphold and promote? The guiding principle of a high-wage area country's immigration policy follows from the insight that to be free in the same sense as trade is free, immigration must be invited. The details follow from the further elucidation and exemplification of the concepts of invitation versus invasion and forced integration. To this end, it is necessary to presuppose, as a conceptual benchmark, the existence of what political philosophers have described as a private property anarchy, anarcho-capitalism, or ordered anarchy. All land is privately owned, including all streets, rivers, airports, and harbors. With respect to some pieces of land, the property title may be unrestricted, that is, the owner is permitted to do whatever he pleases with his property as long as he does not physically damage the property of others. With respect to other territories, the property title may be more or less restricted. As is currently the case in some housing developments, the owner may be bound by contractual limitations on what he can do with his property, restrictive covenants, voluntary zoning, which might include residential rather than commercial use, no buildings more than 4 stories high, no sale or rent to unmarried couples, smokers, or Germans, for instance. Clearly, in this kind of society there is no such thing as freedom of immigration or an immigrant's right of way. Rather, there exists the freedom of many independent private property owners to admit or exclude others from their own property in accordance with their own restricted or unrestricted property titles. Admission to some territories might be easy, while to others it might be nearly impossible. Moreover, admission to the property of one party does not imply the freedom to move around unless other property owners have agreed to such movements. There will be as much immigration or non-immigration, inclusivity or exclusivity, desegregation or segregation, non-discrimination or discrimination as individual owners or associations of individual owners desire. The reason for citing the model of an anarcho-capitalist society is that no such thing as forced integration, uninvited migration, is possible, permitted, within its framework. Under this scenario, no difference between the physical movement of goods and the migration of people exists. Just as every product movement reflects an underlying agreement between sender and receiver, so are all movements of immigrants into and within an anarcho-capitalist society the result of an agreement between the immigrant and one or a series of receiving domestic property owners. Hence, even if the anarcho-capitalist model is ultimately rejected, and if for realism's sake the existence of a government and of public in addition to private goods and property is assumed, it brings into clear focus what a government's immigration policy would have to be if and insofar as this government derived its legitimacy from the sovereignty of the people and was viewed as the outgrowth of an agreement or social contract, as is presumably the case with all modern post-monarchical governments, of course. Surely, such a popular government, which assumed as its primary task the protection of its citizens and their property, the production of domestic security, would want to preserve rather than abolish this no-forced integration feature of anarcho-capitalism. In order to clarify what this implies, it is necessary to explain how an anarcho-capitalist society is altered by the introduction of a government, and how this affects the immigration problem. Since there is no government in an anarcho-capitalist society, there is no clear-cut distinction between inlanders, domestic citizens, and foreigners. This distinction appears only with the establishment of a government. The territory over which a government's power extends then becomes inland, and everyone residing outside of this territory becomes a foreigner. State borders and passports, as distinct from private property borders and titles to property, come into existence, and immigration takes on a new meaning. Immigration becomes immigration by foreigners across state borders, and the decision as to whether or not a person should be admitted no longer rests exclusively with private property owners or associations of such owners, but ultimately with the government qua domestic security producer monopolist. Now, if the government excludes a person while a domestic resident exists who wants to admit this very person onto his property, the result is forced exclusion, and if the government admits a person while no domestic resident exists who wants to have this person on his property, the result is forced integration. Moreover, hand in hand with the institution of a government comes the institution of public property and goods, that is, of property and goods owned collectively by all domestic residents and controlled and administered by the government. The larger or smaller the amount of public government ownership, the greater or smaller will be the potential problem of forced integration. Consider a socialist society like the former Soviet Union or East Germany, for example. All factors of production, capital goods, including all land and natural resources, are publicly owned. Accordingly, if the government admits an uninvited immigrant, it admits him to any place within the country, for without private land ownership there are no limitations on his internal migrations other than those decreed by government. Under socialism, therefore, forced integration can be spread everywhere and thereby immensely intensified. In fact, in the Soviet Union and East Germany, for instance, the government could quarter a stranger in someone else's private house or apartment. This measure and the resulting high-powered forced integration was justified on grounds of the fact that all private houses rested on public land. Socialist countries are not high-wage areas, of course. Or if they are, they will not remain so for long. Their problem is not immigration but emigration pressure. The Soviet Union and East Germany prohibited emigration and killed people for trying to leave the country. However, the problem of the extension and intensification of forced integration persists outside of socialism. To be sure, in non-socialist countries such as the United States, Switzerland, and the Federal Republic of Germany, which are favorite immigration destinations, a government-admitted immigrant could not move just anywhere. His freedom of movement would be severely restricted by the extent of private property and private land ownership in particular. Yet by proceeding on public roads or with public means of transportation, and by staying on public land and in public parks and buildings, an immigrant can cross every domestic resident's path and move into virtually any neighborhood. The smaller the quantity of public property, the less likely this will occur, but as long as any public property exists it cannot be entirely avoided. 6. A popular government that wants to safeguard its citizens and their domestic property from forced integration and foreign invaders has two methods of doing so, a corrective and a preventive one. The corrective method is designed to ameliorate the effects of forced integration once the event has taken place and the invaders are there. As indicated, to achieve this goal the government must reduce the quantity of public property and expand that of private property as much as possible, and whatever the ratio of private to public property may be, the government should help rather than hinder the enforcement of a private property owner's right to admit and exclude others from his property. If virtually all property is owned privately and the government assists in enforcing private ownership rights, the uninvited immigrants, even if they successfully crossed the border and entered the country, would not likely get much further. The more completely this corrective measure is carried out, the higher the degree of private ownership, the smaller will be the need for protective measures, such as border defense. The cost of protection against foreign invaders along the United States-Mexico border, for instance, is comparatively high because for long stretches no private property exists on the US side. However, even if the cost of border protection were lowered by means of privatization, it would not disappear as long as there are substantial income and wage differentials between high and low-wage territories. Hence, in order to fulfill its basic protective function, a high-wage area government must also engage in preventive measures. At all ports of entry and along its borders, the government, as trustee of its citizens, must check all newly arriving persons for an entrance ticket, that is, a valid invitation by a domestic property owner, and anyone not in possession of such a ticket must be expelled at his own expense. Valid invitations are contracts between one or more private domestic recipients, residential or commercial, and the arriving person. Qua contractual admission, the inviting party can only dispose of his own private property. Hence, similar to the scenario of conditional free immigration, the admission implies that the immigrant will be excluded from all publicly funded welfare. On the other hand, it implies that the receiving party must assume legal responsibility for the actions of his invitee for the duration of his stay. The inviter is held liable to the full extent of his property for any crimes by the invitee committed against the person or property of any third party, as parents are held accountable for crimes committed by their offspring as long as these are members of the parental household. This obligation, which implies that inviters will have to carry liability insurance for all of their guests, ends once the invitee has left the country or once another domestic property owner has assumed liability for the person in question by admitting him onto his property. The invitation may be private, personal, or commercial, temporary or permanent, concerning only housing, accommodation, residency, or housing and employment, but there cannot be a valid contract involving only employment and no housing. In any case, however, as a contractual relationship, every invitation may be revoked or terminated by the host, and upon termination, the invitee, whether tourist, visiting businessman, or resident alien, will be required to leave the country unless another resident citizen enters into an invitation contract with him. The invitee, who is at all times subject to the potential risk of immediate expulsion, may lose his legal status as a non-resident or resident alien only upon acquiring citizenship. In accordance with the objective of making all immigration, like trade, invited contractual, the fundamental requirement for citizenship is the acquisition of property ownership, or more precisely the ownership of real estate and residential property. In contrast, it would be inconsistent with the very idea of invited migration to award citizenship according to the territorial principle, as in the US, whereby a child born to a non-resident or resident alien in a host country automatically acquires US citizenship. In fact, as most other high-wage area governments recognize, such a child should acquire the citizenship of his parents. Granting this child citizenship involves the non-fulfillment of a host country government's basic protective function and actually amounts to an invasive act perpetrated by the government against its own citizenry. Becoming a citizen means acquiring the right to stay in a country permanently, and a permanent invitation cannot be secured by any means other than purchasing residential property from a citizen resident. Only by selling real estate to a foreigner does a citizen indicate that he agrees to a guest's permanent stay, and only if the immigrant has purchased and paid for real estate and residential housing in the host country will he assume a permanent interest in his new country's well-being and prosperity. Moreover, finding a citizen who is willing to sell residential property and who is prepared and able to pay for it, although a necessary requirement for the acquisition of citizenship, may not also be sufficient. If and insofar as the domestic property in question is subject to restrictive covenants, the hurdles to be taken by a prospective citizen may be significantly higher. In Switzerland, for instance, citizenship may require that the sale of residential property to foreigners be ratified by a majority of or even all of the directly affected local property owners. 7. Judged by the immigration policy entailed by the objective of protecting one's own citizens from foreign invasion and forced integration, and of rendering all international population movements invited and contractual migrations, the Swiss government does a significantly better job than the United States. It is relatively more difficult to enter Switzerland as an uninvited person, and it is more difficult to stay on as an uninvited alien. In particular, it is far more difficult for a foreigner to acquire citizenship, and the legal distinction between resident citizens and resident aliens is more clearly preserved. These differences notwithstanding, the governments of both Switzerland and the US are pursuing immigration policies that must be deemed far too permissive. Moreover, the excessive permissiveness of their immigration policies and the resulting exposure of the Swiss and American population to forced integration by foreigners is further aggravated by the fact that the extent of public property in both countries and other high-wage areas is substantial, that tax-funded welfare provisions are high and growing and foreigners are not excluded, and that contrary to official pronouncements even the adherence to free trade policies is anything but perfect. Accordingly, in Switzerland, the US and most other high-wage areas, popular protests against immigration policies have grown increasingly louder. It has been the purpose of this chapter not only to make the case for the privatization of public property, domestic laissez-faire, and international free trade, but in particular for the adoption of a restrictive immigration policy. By demonstrating that free trade is inconsistent with both unconditionally or conditionally free immigration and requires instead that migration be subject to the condition of being invited and contractual, it is our hope to contribute to more enlightened future policies in this area. 9. On cooperation, tribe, city, and state. Ludwig von Mises has explained the evolution of society, of human cooperation under the division of labor, as the combined result of two factors. These are first, the fact of differences among men, labor, and/or the inequalities of the geographical distribution of the nature-given factors of production, land, and second, the recognition of the fact that work performed under the division of labor is more productive than work performed in self-sufficient isolation. He writes, if and as far as labor under the division of labor is more productive than isolated labor, and if and as far as man is able to realize this fact, human action itself tends toward cooperation and association, man becomes a social being not in sacrificing his own concerns for the sake of a mythical Moloch, society, but in aiming at an improvement in his own welfare. Experience teaches that this condition, higher productivity achieved under division of labor, is present because its cause, the inborn inequality of men and the inequality in the geographical distribution of the natural factors of production, is real. Thus we are in a position to comprehend the course of social evolution. Several points are worth emphasizing here in order to reach a proper understanding of this fundamental insight of Mises into the nature of society, points which will also help us realize some first, preliminary conclusions regarding the role of sex and race in social evolution. First, it is important to recognize that inequalities with respect to labor and/or land are a necessary but by no means a sufficient condition for the emergence of human cooperation. If all humans were identical and everyone were equipped with identical natural resources, everyone would produce the same qualities and quantities of goods, and the idea of exchange and cooperation would never enter anyone's mind. However, the existence of inequalities is not enough to bring about cooperation. There are also differences in the animal kingdom, most notably the difference of sex, gender, among members of the same animal species as well as the difference between the various species and subspecies, races, yet there is no such thing as cooperation among animals. To be sure, there are bees and ants who are referred to as animal societies. But they form societies only in a metaphorical sense. The cooperation between bees and ants is assured purely by biological factors, by innate instincts. They cannot not cooperate as they do, and without some fundamental changes in their biological makeup, the division of labor among them is not in danger of breaking down. In distinct contrast, the cooperation between humans is the outcome of purposeful individual actions, of the conscious aiming at the attainment of individual ends. As a result, the division of labor among men is constantly threatened by the possibility of disintegration. Within the animal kingdom, then, the difference between the sexes can only be said to be a factor of attraction, of reproduction, and proliferation, whereas the differences of the species and subspecies can be referred to as a factor of repulsion, of separation, or even of fatal antagonism, of evasion, of struggle, and annihilation. Moreover, within the animal kingdom it makes no sense to describe the behavior resulting from sexual attraction as either consensual, love, or non-consensual, rape, nor does it make any sense to speak of the relationship between the members of different species or subspecies as one of hostility and hatred or of criminal and victim. In the animal kingdom there only exists interaction, which is neither cooperative, social behavior nor criminal, antisocial behavior. As Mises writes, there is interaction, reciprocal influence, between all parts of the universe, between the wolf and the sheep that he devours, between the germ and the man it kills, between the falling stone and the thing upon which it falls. Society, on the other hand, always involves men acting in cooperation with other men in order to let all participants attain their own ends. 3. In addition to an inequality of labor and/or land, a second requirement must be fulfilled if human cooperation is to evolve. Men, at least two of them, must be capable of recognizing the higher productivity of a division of labor based on the mutual recognition of private property, of the exclusive control of every man over his own body and over his physical appropriations and possessions as compared to either self-sufficient isolation or aggression, depredation, and domination. That is, there must be a minimum of intelligence or rationality, and men, at least two of them, must have the sufficient moral strength to act on this insight and be willing to forego immediate gratification for even greater future satisfaction. But for intelligence and conscious will, writes Mises, men would have forever remained deadly foes of one another, irreconcilable rivals in their endeavors to secure a portion of the scarce supply of means of sustenance provided by nature. Each man would have been forced to view all other men as his enemies. His craving for the satisfaction of his own appetites would have brought him into an implacable conflict with all his neighbors. No sympathy could possibly develop under such a state of affairs. A member of the human race who is completely incapable of understanding the higher productivity of labor performed under a division of labor based on private property is not properly speaking a person, a persona, but falls instead in the same moral category as an animal of either the harmless sort, to be domesticated and employed as a producer or consumer good, or to be enjoyed as a free good, or the wild and dangerous one, to be fought as a pest. On the other hand, there are members of the human species who are capable of understanding the insight but who lack the moral strength to act accordingly. Such persons are either harmless brutes living outside of and separated from human society, or they are more or less dangerous criminals. They are persons who knowingly act wrongly and who, besides having to be tamed or even physically defeated, must also be punished in proportion to the severity of their crime to make them understand the nature of their wrongdoings and hopefully to teach them a lesson for the future. Human cooperation, society, can only prevail and advance as long as man is capable of subduing, taming, appropriating, and cultivating his physical and animalistic surroundings, and as long as he succeeds in suppressing crime, reducing it to a rarity by means of self-defense, property protection, and punishment. II. As soon as these requirements are fulfilled, however, and as long as man, motivated by the knowledge of the higher physical productivity of a division of labor based on private property, is engaged in mutually beneficial exchanges, the natural forces of attraction arising from the differences in the sexes and the natural forces of repulsion or enmity arising from the differences between and even within the races, can be transformed into genuinely social relations. Sexual attraction can be transformed from copulation to consensual relations, mutual bonds, households, families, love, and affection. It testifies to the enormous productivity of the family household that no other institution has proven more durable or capable of producing such emotions. And inter- and intraracial repulsion can be transformed from feelings of enmity or hostility to a preference for cooperating, trading with one another only indirectly from afar and physically separated and spatially segregated, rather than directly, as neighbors and associates. Human cooperation, division of labor, based on the one hand on integrated family households and on the other one on separated households, villages, tribes, nations, races, etc., wherein man's natural biological attractions and repulsions for and against one another are transformed into a mutually recognized system of spatial, geographical allocation, of physical approximation and integration or of separation and segregation, and of direct or of indirect contact, exchange and trade, leads to improved standards of living, a growing population, further extensification and intensification of the division of labor, and increasing diversity and differentiation. As a result of this development and an ever more rapid increase of goods and desires which can be acquired and satisfied only indirectly, professional traders, merchants, and trading centers will emerge. Merchants and cities function as the mediators of the indirect exchanges between territorially separated households and communal associations, and thus become the sociological and geographical locus and focus of intertribal or interracial association. It will be within the class of merchants in which racially, ethnically, or tribally mixed marriages are relatively most common, and since most people, of both reference groups, typically disapprove of such alliances, it will be the wealthier members of the merchant class who can afford such extravagances. However, even the members of the wealthiest merchant families will be highly circumspect in such endeavors. In order not to endanger their own position as a merchant, great care must be taken that every mixed marriage is, or at least appears to the relevant ethnicities to be, a marriage between equals. Consequently, the racial mixture brought on by the merchant class will more likely than not contribute to genetic luxuration rather than genetic pauperization. Accordingly, it will be in the big cities as the centers of international trade and commerce, where mixed couples and their offspring typically reside, where members of different ethnicities, tribes, races, even if they do not intermarry, still come into regular direct personal contact with each other. In fact, that they do so is required by the fact that their respective tribesmen back home do not have to deal directly with more or less distasteful strangers, and where the most elaborate and highly developed system of physical and functional integration and segregation will arise. It will also be in the big cities where, as the subjective reflection of this complex system of spatio-functional allocation, citizens will develop the most highly refined forms of personal and professional conduct, etiquette, and style. It is the city that breeds civilization and civilized life. To maintain law and order within a big city, with its intricate pattern of physical and functional integration and separation, a great variety of jurisdictions, judges, arbitrators, and enforcement agencies in addition to self-defense and private protection will come into existence. There will be what one might call governance in the city, but there will be no government state. For a government to arise, it is necessary that one of these judges, arbitrators, or enforcement agencies succeed in establishing himself as a monopolist. That is, he must be able to insist that no citizen can choose anyone but him as the judge or arbitrator of last resort, and he must successfully suppress any other judge or arbitrator from trying to assume the same role, thereby competing against him. More interesting than the question of what a government is, however, are the following: how is it possible that one judge can acquire a judiciary monopoly, given that other judges will naturally oppose any such attempt, and what specifically makes it possible, and what does it imply, to establish a monopoly of law and order in a big city, i.e., over a territory with ethnically, tribally, and/or racially mixed populations? First, almost by definition it follows that with the establishment of a city government, interracial, tribal, ethnic, and clannish familial tensions will increase because the monopolist, whoever he is, must be of one ethnic background rather than another. Hence, his being the monopolist will be considered by the citizens of other ethnic backgrounds as an insulting setback, i.e., as an act of arbitrary discrimination against the people of another race, tribe, or clan. The delicate balance of peaceful interracial, interethnic, and interfamilial cooperation, achieved through an intricate system of spatial and functional integration, association, and separation, segregation, will be upset. Second, this insight leads directly to the answer as to how a single judge can possibly outmaneuver all others. In brief, to overcome the resistance by competing judges, an aspiring monopolist must shore up added support in public opinion. In an ethnically mixed milieu, this typically means playing the race card. The prospective monopolist must raise the racial, tribal, or clannish consciousness among citizens of his own race, tribe, clan, etc., and promise, in return for their support, to be more than an impartial judge in matters relating to one's own race, tribe, or clan, that is, exactly what citizens of other ethnic backgrounds are afraid of, i.e., of being treated with less than impartiality. At this stage in this sociological reconstruction, let us, without further explanation, briefly introduce a few additional steps required to arrive at a realistic contemporary scenario regarding race, sex, society, and state. Naturally, a monopolist will try to maintain his position and possibly even turn it into an hereditary title, i.e., become a king. However, accomplishing this within an ethnically or tribally mixed city is a far more difficult task than within a homogeneous rural community. Instead, in big cities, governments are far more likely to take on the form of a democratic republic with open entry into the position of supreme ruler, competing political parties, and popular elections. In the course of the political centralization process, the territorial expansion of one government at the expense of another, this big city model of government, then, will become essentially its only form, that of a democratic state exercising a judicial monopoly over a territory with racially and/or ethnically widely diverse populations. While the judicial monopoly of governments extends nowadays typically far beyond a single city and in some cases over almost an entire continent, the consequences for the relations between the races and sexes and spatial approximation and segregation of government monopoly can still be best observed in the great cities and their decline from centers of civilization to centers of degeneration and decay. With a central government extending over cities and the countryside, countries, inlanders, and foreigners are created. This has no immediate effect on the countryside, where there are no foreigners, members of different ethnicities, races, etc. But in the great trading centers, where there are mixed populations, the legal distinction between inlander and foreigner, rather than ethnically or racially distinct private property owners, will almost invariably lead to some form of forced exclusion and a reduced level of interethnic cooperation. Moreover, with a central state in place, the physical segregation and separation of city and countryside will be systematically reduced. In order to exercise its judicial monopoly, the central government must be able to access every inlander's private property, and to do so it must take control of all existing roads and even expand the existing system of roadways. Different households and villages are thus brought into closer contact than they might have preferred, and the physical distance and separation of city and countryside will be significantly diminished. Thus, internally, forced integration will be promoted. Naturally, this tendency toward forced integration due to the monopolization of roads and streets will be most pronounced in the cities. This tendency will be further stimulated if, as is typical, the government takes its seat in a city. A popularly elected government cannot help using its judicial monopoly to engage in redistributive policies in favor of its ethnic or racial constituency, which will invariably attract even more of its own tribe's members, and with changes in the government, more members of even more and different tribes will be drawn from the countryside to the capital city to receive either government jobs or handouts. As a result, not only will the capital become relatively oversized as other cities shrink. At the same time, due to the monopolization of public streets whereon everyone may proceed wherever he wants, all forms of ethnic, tribal, or racial tensions and animosities will be stimulated. Moreover, while interracial, tribal, and ethnic marriages were formerly rare and restricted to the upper strata of the merchant class, with the arrival of bureaucrats and bums from various racial, tribal, and ethnic backgrounds in the capital city, the frequency of interethnic marriage will increase, and the focus of interethnic sex, even without marriage, will increasingly shift from the upper class of merchants to the lower classes, even to the lowest class of welfare recipients. Rather than genetic luxuration, the consequence is increased genetic pauperization, a tendency furthered by the fact that government welfare support will naturally lead to an increase in the birth rate of welfare recipients relative to the birth rate of other members, in particular of members of the upper class of their tribe or race. As a result of this overproportional growth of low and even underclass people and an increasing number of ethnically, tribally, racially mixed offspring, especially in the lower and lowest social strata, the character of democratic, popular government will gradually change as well. Rather than the race card being essentially the only instrument of politics, politics becomes increasingly class politics. The government rulers can and will no longer rely exclusively on their ethnic, tribal, or racial appeal and support, but increasingly they must try to find support across tribal or racial lines by appealing to the universal, not tribe or race-specific, feeling of envy and egalitarianism, i.e., to social class, the untouchables or the slaves versus the masters, the workers versus the capitalists, the poor versus the rich, etc. The increasing admixture of egalitarian class politics to the pre-existing tribal policies leads to even more racial and social tension and hostility, and to an even greater proliferation of the low and underclass population. In addition to certain ethnic or tribal groups being driven out of the cities as a result of tribal policies, increasingly also members of the upper classes of all ethnic or tribal groups will leave the city for the suburbs, only to be followed, by means of public, government, transportation, by those very people whose behaviors they had tried to escape. With the upper class and the merchants leaving in larger numbers, however, one of the last remaining civilizing forces will be weakened, and what is left behind in the cities will represent an increasingly negative selection of the population, of government bureaucrats who work but no longer live there, and of the lowlifes and the social outcasts of all tribes and races who live there yet who increasingly do not work but survive on welfare. Just think of Washington, D.C. When one would think that matters could not possibly become worse, they do. After the race and the class card have been played and done their devastating work, the government turns to the sex and gender card, and racial justice and social justice are complemented by gender justice. The establishment of a government, a judicial monopoly, not only implies that formally separated jurisdictions, as within ethnically or racially segregated districts, for instance, are forcibly integrated, it implies at the same time that formally fully integrated jurisdictions, as within households and families, will be forcibly broken down or even dissolved. Rather than regarding intrafamily or household matters, including subjects such as abortion, for instance, as no one else's business to be judged and arbitrated within the family by the head of the household or family members, once a judicial monopoly has been established, its agents, the government, also become and will naturally strive to expand their role as judge and arbitrator of last resort in all family matters. To gain popular support for its role, the government, besides playing one tribe, race, or social class against another, will likewise promote divisiveness within the family, between the sexes, husbands and wives, and the generations, parents and children. Once again, this will be particularly noticeable in the big cities.